Welcome everyone to the Community-Driven Archives, Local Needs, Global Practices in Safeguarding Living Cultural Heritage discussion event. I know we're coming together from a wide range of time zones, so good morning, good afternoon, and evening. Thank you for taking the time to join us for what will undoubtedly be engaging and thought-provoking presentations and discussions. A special thank you, of course, to our distinguished panelists for bringing your insights and expertise to the discussions today, and we will introduce them in due course. I'm Nicole Saylor, Director of the American Folklife Center, for which I previously served over several years as the head of its extensive archives, and I'll talk about that briefly in a moment. I do want to first point out that this event is being recorded and will be made available for viewing at the Library of Congress website, as well as on the library's YouTube channel in the near future. On that note, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks for the behind-the-scenes support team. They planned this, facilitated this event, starting with Library Events Liaison Elizabeth Schreiber Byers and American Folklife Center staff, so Folklife specialists Michelle Stefano and Doug Peach, Thea Austin, our coordinator of the center's homegrown concert series, among other public programs, reference librarian Alina Magoni, who you may all see popping information into the chat as the conversations unfold, and assisting with the Q&A periods later. I'd also like to thank John Fenn, head of research and programs, who is with us today as well. And for his help in shaping the event, particularly the first roundtable discussions, I'd like to thank Robert Barron, who's been a friend of the center for many years. Lastly, today's event was organized with the support of two very important organizations in the field of folklife, and internationally, the field of intangible cultural heritage and the study of safeguarding it, the American Folklore Society and the International Society for Ethnology and Folklore. Sincere thanks to you all for supporting us. In a couple of minutes, I'll hand over the introduction to Michelle Stefano, who will provide some housekeeping notes for the event. But for now, I would direct you to the chat where there are links to today's Community-Driven Archives program. It includes a schedule, information on the panelist presentations, and scholarly and professional backgrounds on each of the panelists. So today is structured in two roundtable discussions that bring together panelists who will share their expertise in real-world examples, cultural documentation, and archival preservation efforts that first and foremost serve to uplift and safeguard the histories, heritage, and cultures of cultural communities and social groups from a wide range of geographical and socio-cultural perspectives. It's both an honor and really exciting for us to host these discussions on the topic of community-centered and community-led archives, which we also view as including the activities that generate archival materials. So cultural research and documentation processes. And I can certainly state that it's the aim of the center to continue these conversations through future events like this in the coming years. Indeed, this is a topic and area of activity that strikes right to the core of the work we do at the American Folklife Center, and we've been doing for decades now, and and it reflects a long-standing ethos within the center around ethical and legal issues, considerations and practices concerning ownership, representation, and collaborative practice with respect to archival preservation and access. For those who may not be familiar with the center, it was established by law, Public Law 92-201, also known as the American Folklife Preservation Act by the US Congress in 1976. And in a nutshell, our mandate is to preserve and present folklife, but in reality, that's just shorthand for a wide-reaching mandate that drives multi-pronged and dynamic activities and programming. So for instance, on the presenting side, the center staff produces an array of public programs, such as events like this, concerts, performances, lectures that are both in person and online, as well as generates educational materials, training materials that support artists, culture keepers, researchers, and the public. And we raise awareness of the importance of cultural diversity in general and folklife in particular to foster greater engagement with it and to support its safeguarding for the future. On the preserving side, the center is home to one of the oldest and largest ethnographic archives in the world. We have millions of items, audio, visual, manuscript materials, and that relates to about 3,400 collections that span the late 19th century through today. And the archives is just continuing to grow and grow. Staff lead collecting acquisitions, processing, preservation, digitization, and access efforts, and developing finding aids, research guides, and other online presentations that enhance discoverability of these collections, as well as we continually add the dozens of center collections online and through the library's website. And again, ethical and legal best practices are at the forefront of our stewardship of collections in terms of source and descendant community representation and ownership, and ensuring their guidance of considerations and processes concerning access. Moreover, bridging the two preservation and presentation drivers of our work are a range of fellowships, awards, and grants that serve to support the field and safeguarding of people's living cultural traditions, practices, and expressions, including support of cultural research and documentation projects, especially in terms of community self-representation and ethnographic documentation and archival preservation processes. So with that, I want to thank you again for joining us today. I'll now hand it over to Michelle, who will set the stage a bit further for today's proceedings, as well as talk about our most recent initiative related to community-driven documentation, the Community Collections Grants. So thank you.
Thank you, Nikki, and hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us. This is an excellent turnout for what will, as Nikki said, undoubtedly be fruitful discussions. So as promised, I'm just going to go over some housekeeping notes here. Today's discussions are structured into two roundtable panels, and there will be a 30-minute break in between the two. And so note that the webinar will remain open. You can do whatever you want, but we will all be here for you for the second panel that will begin at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. The Q&A and discussion period will happen after all presentations in each of the two roundtable discussion panels. And we kindly ask you to direct your questions to the Q&A feature that's part of your Zoom dashboard, wherever that is on your screen, and not to enter questions into the chat. So that will help us to manage the questions for the discussion periods. You certainly can indicate the panelist to whom you'd like to ask questions. We will be monitoring the Q&A and chat. As you've already been seeing, we've been entering resources into it, and questions will be posed by the panel moderators. We're trying out a new interactive feature for the Q&A feature itself, and that is you can thumbs up questions that you find good, and they will rise in popularity, making it easier for moderators to see them. But the chat is also open for all of your general commentary, and you are welcome to privately send me heart emojis as well. So I am just going to talk a little bit about today's event, set the stage a little further, and how it connects very strongly to the work we do at the AFC, and particularly the Community Collections Grants, which is a new initiative for us, as Nikki mentioned earlier. So the first motivator, there are two main motivations behind today's event. The topic of community-led documentation and archival preservation efforts again strongly resonates with the longstanding mission and work of the center, as Nikki outlined. Since its establishment, the center has prioritized the continued enrichment of representation of and by diverse culture keepers, their communities, and social groups in the center's archives, which we can argue certainly constitute a part of the historical and cultural record, especially here in the United States, as well as enriching representation and inclusion in all of the center's programming. For decades, center staff have striven to support source and descendant community ownership and reclamation of collections, and seek their guidance on access issues, as well as support community-led documentation and archival efforts. While there are many examples, some that I could bring up here span the early days of the center with the Federal Cylinder Project, the ongoing Ancestral Voices Initiative, and through our grants and awards in more recent years, such as the Community Collections grants that I'll be talking about in just a moment. A second motivation behind today's discussions comes from the wider global perspective. Particularly UNESCO's popular Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, which turns 20 this year. In some ways, it's still young, but yet it has built a lot of footing in its implementation across over 180 countries or states parties to the convention across the world. And as such, it has been spurring an increasing amount, almost innumerable amount of documentation efforts centered on people's intangible cultural heritage from across the world. Nonetheless, questions do remain with respect to community involvement in these documentation processes that the convention has spurred, particularly what is termed within the context of the convention inventorying intangible cultural heritage, and questions also have arisen for a while now regarding the safeguarding of this documentation, the result of a lot of these documentation efforts, and thus the need for more discussions and exchanges of ideas and practice on community-driven documentation, inventorying, and archival efforts, included related ethical and legal considerations. And Robert Barron, our first moderator of the first panel, will speak more on this broader global view. So today's discussions are based on bringing together distinguished scholars and professionals to share examples of such community-driven work, some of which has been underway for years, and to surface the issues and considerations, both theoretical and practical, as well as the challenges and lessons learned that relate to true community-led and collaborative safeguarding efforts. And I just need to switch between my screens, which is a big deal for me. So one example that has certainly provided inspiration for today are our recent community collections grants. You've been seeing photos from projects supported by those grants in the slides so far. And this is an initiative that's part of a broader initiative at the library called the Of the People Widening the Path initiative that is supported by the Mellon Foundation. In terms of basics, the grants are up to $50,000 for a 12-month documentation period, with the main aim of supporting documentation of, for, and by cultural communities, social groups, artists, and culture keepers with respect to their contemporary cultural traditions, practices, and activities. Recipients are both individuals and organizations, and there are up to 10 funded projects per year. We view the grant as serving to remove financial and logistical barriers to doing documentation work, where funding can be used for contracting labor, participant honoraria, travel, as well as the purchasing of equipment, and so on. Importantly, the grant program also serves to enhance source community documentation, repositories, and archives, while expanding library and center collections, as project team documentation will become archival collections in the AFC and eventually made available online on the Library of Congress website. And of course, project teams do not have to submit all that they document in their projects to the center. They make those decisions based on their needs. Being that the center serves as a cultural heritage institution at the national level as part of the nation's library, the program or aspects of it can offer a model or ways forward for larger institutions to support this kind of community-led on-the-ground work. In addition to funding, center staff support project teams on a one-on-one and group basis, providing regular guidance and or training in documentation methods, ethics and legal considerations, and preparation for archival preservation of their materials that they've generated. including the preparation of metadata for their interviews, photos, and videos, among other materials that they've created. As we are well into the second year of working with project teams, and as awardees are based in a range of time zones from across the Caribbean and the Pacific, we have kept to this general timeline that you see in front of you as a general flow of our collaborative work with project teams, where for instance, in the early months of their project periods, we facilitate a series of group Zooms to first and foremost get to know each other, and for them to get to know each other as well, and to begin a building of a sense of community as we move forward, but to also discuss the various aspects of documentation and archival preparation that I've already noted. And as the halfway point approaches, we also begin setting up one-on-one meetings with teams that have already been happening, but focused on, and these meetings are with the center's archive staff and cataloging staff to really focus on the entering and learning of our metadata tools, which in particular is a pretty sophisticated spreadsheet tool that has been created by center archive staff for collecting the descriptions, the context around each and every item or file that they've created in their documentation projects. So these individual and group discussions and trainings, particularly with respect to their project documentation metadata and ensuring that awardees are describing their materials as the experts of their cultures that they represent, reflect this idea, this notion that many colleagues here at the center often say that the documentarian is the first archivist. And this is with respect to the importance of thinking ahead during documentation activities to the preservation and the access to and engagement with these rich materials for and in the future. This collaborative approach only heightens self-representation in metadata generation and collection, and also within ethnographic documentation processes at large, and upholds community expertise in conceptualizing, contextualizing, and categorizing their cultural materials in their words and on their terms. I will add that the center's Archie Green Fellowships, a previous grant program for over a decade now, which supports documentation projects focused on occupational culture, has served as a model in a number of ways for the Community Collections Grant Program, but particularly in terms of this collaborative approach to metadata creation. So the Community Collections grants continue to be a work in progress. We are continually learning lessons from award recipients themselves, as well as how the program in general can be improved more on the internal side of things, such as needing to have those metadata and archival preservation conversations earlier on in their project periods. And also archive staff have been developing more collaborative tools with respect to entering the actual metadata for teams, project teams where there's multiple team members in different locations being able to access and generate that metadata information at the same time. So in terms of the future of this project, this grant program, which is again supported by the Mellon Foundation from 2022 through 2024. And I will say that the next cohort of awardees will be announced in the coming months, hopefully later this year. So do stay tuned. But we are exploring at the AFC ways to sustain this grant program for the future, as it has been very successful. And as I'm sure you're thinking, it is also very important. There's also support for culminating year of programming to share out and celebrate the Community Collection Grant awardees, their organizations, their projects, as well as part of the larger of the people sharing out and celebrating of that larger initiative, where other divisions in the library have also received funding to support various artists and scholars in different kinds of grants across the library. I also want to note that 5 awardee teams and individuals will be presenting on their projects. For those who may be attending the virtual meeting of the American Folklore Society annual meeting there's a session where we'll be talking about the grants and hearing from them about their projects and the lessons learned and challenges they have overcome on October 11th, just in a couple of weeks. Okay, so we are doing well with time, and I'm very proud of myself in that respect. But so we will be now moving on, since we are a little early. So that gives you a little extra time, Robert, in moderating and running your session. So we'll be moving on to the first discussion panel, documenting living traditions and the changing roles of archives. I just want to remind everyone that for those joining the past couple moments, this event is recorded, and that also includes the Q&A questions and chat. We kindly ask you to direct your questions into the Q&A feature. And to read more about each panelist's scholarly and educational backgrounds, the work that they're doing, and a little bit more about each of their presentations, there's a link in the chat to today's event program. So without further ado, I will be turning it over to folklorist Robert Barron, again, a friend of the Center for many years, who will be moderating this first discussion panel. Robert is on the faculty of the Master's Program in Cultural Sustainability at Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland. He has served as director of the Folk Arts Program, Music Program, and Museum Program of the New York State Council on the Arts. He also serves as the secretary of the Intangible Cultural Heritage NGO Forum, which provides advisory services in the framework of the UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. And he is co-chair of the Cultural Heritage and Property Working Group of the International Society for Ethnology and Folklore, also known as CF. And he's also vice president of the Fellows of the American Folklore Society. So I'm going to stop sharing, Robert, and I'm going to be turning it over to you now.
Thanks so much. Whoops, where are we? Share. Here we go. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. And I can think of a few more appropriate venues for this event than the American Folk Life Center, the Library of Congress. It's been a pioneer in repatriation of sound materials, of various kinds of documentation materials, and it's continued its work for over 40 years. I have to particularly give a shout out to Judith Gray and Guha Shankar, who've been involved in a continuing way for decades in this work, as well as other staff at AFC. I'm approaching archives as pretty much of an outsider. I'm not a professional archivist, but I've experienced what Tony Seeger has called the joy and discovery of experiencing archives as a user, and also as from time to time by depositing administrative materials and documentation that I've worked with. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to speak about some topics and issues that we'll be considering today. Fresh air in archives, opening the windows, letting some air waft in with attention nonetheless for, of course, rigorous climate control. So let me just proceed to the next slide if I can do this. Okay, here we go. Always technological challenges. So this is a new day for archives that contain folk life materials, intangible cultural heritage materials, if you will, ethnomusicology archives, music archives. And increasingly, archives have become culturally generative institutions that proactively engage with communities, acting in response to their interests, moving from a role that was more a venue for scholars and specialist researchers. And archives act as activist institutions to revitalize traditions, to be agents of cultural exploration and revitalization. There's a reimagining and an expansion of what dissemination and access means in archives as part of the fundamental mission of archives. Communities are shaping the direction of archives through co-curation, where there's a sharing of authority, and reinterpreting the collections from their perspective and in collaboration. with researchers. There's also the creation of community-based repositories of local archives, what's known as keeping places in Australia. And there's also the repatriation of archival materials. And the act of repatriation, again, as the AFC has exemplified, has involved the generation of programming along with the experience of returning the materials, and created new relationships with the source communities that contribute the materials to the archive. We need to think about how communities engage with researchers and specialists and others using archives. And there's been a paradigm shift in authority in the fields that study culture and in archives as well. And archives have been, many archives, more and more archives have been creative and very thoughtful about how this authority is shielded and yielded. The knowledge of source communities is shaping and determining how materials are interpreted. So this is a shift in epistemological authority that's occurred, again, in cultural fields as well as archives. The relationship aims to be reciprocal as well as dialogical, meaning that there won't necessarily be total agreement about the interpretation. Often there won't. There'll be different perspectives, of course, but there'll be dialogue. And metadata may change as well, with community-based categories, cultural categories that replace or supplement the metadata that was originally created by the individual, the scholar who deposited the material. This co-creation of knowledge has major implications for scholarship in general, and the methods in which scholars and researchers study the communities they work with, and the revisioning, the rethinking of their scholarship. But we need to also remember that these asymmetries in power remain, and if there's still the authority on the part of the archivist, of the cultural specialist, to frame the projects, to determine accessioning, processing, codifying, and protection of materials. At the same time, it's important to train non-specialists in these skills in the craft of archiving. Another issue with engagement, of course, is informed consent, which may include restrictions on access of various kinds. Issues of ownership may be at play. It's a long discussion about intellectual property, but even with communities, it may not be clear who owns materials. There may be moral rights to materials, even if there's not legal ownership. And restrictions on use and access is especially challenging now in the digital age, because digital materials are, of course, infinitely copyable. There's some answers to these challenges about consent and access and ownership. Mukurtu, which involves traditional knowledge labels that are presented and provided by communities regarding use restrictions, sacred, secular materials, etc. Paradisic in Australia has created model online agreements for use that users need to fill out. The copyright restrictions that involve, again, moral rights. And in some situations, there'll be a prescription of outsider access, meaning that outsiders will not be allowed to see certain materials. And for example, with ritual materials that relate to rituals and religion and sacred traditions, that it might dilute the power of these materials and to have them used by others or seen by other people. So that's something we need to be sensitive to. Moving to access and interpretation, first of all, there's a change in the projection of archives and the imaging to the world. Again, they've been in the past primarily domains of academically credentialed scholars, and some archives indeed remain that way. But there's now a new sense of belonging with communities that archives in the fields that are represented among people attending this conference are vanguarding. It's also a vibrant virtual presence of archives. Materials are exhibited on site through streaming, and this extensive digitization, which of course facilitates access of moving images, print materials, and audio, of course. And mobile devices also facilitate access, and that's particularly important in parts of the world where there's limited connectivity and limited resources financially to with regard to technology. And of course, the interpretation of collections by source communities. And there's interactivity that occurs on archive websites, including crowdsourcing the transcription and correction of transcripts. The Irish Folklore Archive has done some really exciting work in that vein, uploading new materials on site, and even the opportunity to hear a song and to sing along to it and contribute new materials, such as the Folklore Archives in Latvia has created on the website. So it's really good and exhilarating to look at some of these new websites and see what's happening as dynamically providing a virtual presence for archives. Repatriation and archives in general are springboards for cultural revitalization and amplifying cultural traditions. There are a variety of kinds of platforms and products that do that. There are recordings, there are publications that are accessible to non-scholarly audiences as well as scholars, the community events. All these contribute to amplification and community voices. And what's of paramount importance is to have communities representing their culture and their own voices. And repatriation is something which is extremely important. It's a redressive and reparative process, decolonizing, particularly with regard to indigenous communities, where there were extractive practices by researchers in the past. And there's what's happening through repatriation is the return of high quality digital copies. And the AFC's Federal Cylinder Project in the early 80s was a pioneer in this area. So providing these copies is accompanied by ceremonies, by performances, by high quality, vivid, attractive booklets. We've all done this at the Association for Cultural Equity, where I'm on the board, and the ACE, the Association for Cultural Equity, has done this with the Alan Lomax recordings in the Caribbean, various parts in the US as well as in Europe. Another kind of platform are videos that are instructional videos that enable community members to learn the practices and to present the materials and learn about archives. There's also the creation of educational materials, curricula, and databases. All this acts to reinforce and to reclaim traditions for the communities where repatriation occurs. It reawakens cultural memory. It stimulates the renewed practice of tradition through the recirculation of traditions. It can mean incorporating traditional materials in contemporary performances in which use and adapt the traditional materials in new ways and artistically innovative ways, along with presenting the traditions as they're customarily practiced and been treasured for generations. And it also creates more equitability, sharing of power, sharing of authority, new relationships with the source community. So repatriation is very often been a win-win for everybody. So I want to close by speaking about the integral relationship between field research, access, archiving, and public programs. It's what the founding director of AFC called the cycle of activity. And it's something which needs to be intrinsic to folk life, ethnomusicology, folk music, any activities involving folk life and intangible cultural heritage projects. And just a side about intangible cultural heritage, it's a term that's used in much of the world among the 180 plus nations that have ratified the ICH Convention. And we can essentially think about it as meaning the same thing as folk life. There are institutions such as notably ARCE, which we'll hear about in a minute, which have include in their archives repatriated material, generate new field research and have training and documentation production. So this is a cycle of activity integral to the work of the archive, where archives really become focal institutions in generating sustainability traditions as well as preservation. A few words about the UNESCO ICH convention. As Michelle mentioned, it's generated inventorying and documentation on an unprecedented global scale with over 180 countries, as I said, but unfortunately, there's been too little attention to archiving within the kinds of guidelines and mandates that the convention provides and training. There's a need for stakeholders in ICH to recognize the integration of inventorying with archiving and archival training, and also to think about inventorying as involving documentation. It's something that we've done in our fields of folklore, ethnomusicology, ethnology for generations. And there are archives, existing archives, that can be extremely valuable for ICH projects. They should be consulted and used as repositories and encouraged for this use. And the creation of new kinds of repositories of keeping places as part of the ICH project. This is really essential for safeguarding, which is the core mission of ICH. It means safeguarding and perpetuation, sustainability of traditions for people who are practitioners now as well as in the future. And of course, there's the endangerment, the risk. I mean, endangerment is a charged word, but indeed it's relevant with regard to archives, because if materials are lost, if they're not documented, if they don't remain in human memory, then they're lost forever. And finally, to say that UNESCO has a charter on the preservation of digital heritage, as well as a Memory of the World program. And both of these could be articulated and related better to the ICH project. As Michelle mentioned, I'm on the Cultural Heritage and Property Working Group of International Society for Ethnology and Folklore, CF, and we're doing what we can to spread the word, spread the good word, encourage and stimulate archival work within the ICH project. So now it's time to to stop sharing my screen and to turn the presentations over to Shubha Chowdhury and Anthony Seeger. And we do have the bios for both of them, but I will say that we're extremely privileged to have both of them here today. They are global forces in archiving and ethnomusicology, in work that involves both scholarship and practice. Tony Seeger has more than any other person, I would say, over the last 30, 40 years, heightened awareness of the importance of archives for sustainability of culture and forge new directions for archives with joy and discovery. And Shubha, as I mentioned, with ARCE, which she should give her title. She's the Associate Director General for Archives of the Archives and Research Center of Ethnomusicology, associated with the American Institute of Indian Studies. And Anthony Seeger is the Professor Emeritus at UCLA, Curator Emeritus at the Smithsonian, where he was a driving force for the development of Folkways record, as well as various and sundry other things that you can see in the bio. So Shubha and Tony, take it away. Your presentation is called Communities and Archives, Trust, Flexibility, and Collaboration. And thanks everybody for your attention.
Hi, are we both going to be shown at the same time? How is this going to work? There we are. Okay. Hi. Good morning, good day, or good evening. I'm not sure where you are. Thank you, Robert, for the extremely generous introduction. And archives are indeed locations of excitement and discovery, and we expect this event will be as well. We didn't know in advance what Michelle and Robert were going to say, so some of what our presentation covers, they have mentioned in their presentations, and you will hear it again, perhaps from a different perspective. We are speaking to you from New Delhi, India, and the state of Vermont in the United States. And our objective is to address documenting living traditions and archives on a global level and discuss some of the kinds of relationships that can be established between communities and archives. And we'll illustrate some of our points with examples from South America and from the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology in India. But we will mostly be speaking in general about international community archives issues. The general issues we talk about, however, will probably appear in some of the other papers today. We apologize for reading from a text. It's very difficult to coordinate a short two-person presentation without rambling or going far over time. So my apologies, and here we go. You have our screen. Our PowerPoints are now showing. It's impossible to talk about documenting living traditions without reference to the UNESCO 2003 Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. Today, intangible cultural heritage, or ICH, is often referred to as living heritage, and this contrasts it with monuments and built environments. With the exception of Patrick Maundo and Shubha Chowdhury, none of the presenters today live in countries that have ratified this convention. But over 178 nations have signed on to it, and the convention has transformed cultural policies in many countries around the world. Among the nations that haven't signed are the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. One of the most radical features of the 2003 convention was an insistence that proposal for safeguarding cultural heritage should come from local communities and not only from governmental cultural agencies. Even though subsequent regulations have reduced the role of communities, the concept of local community now has a global reach and is used almost everywhere. The committee that produced the glossary of terms used in the convention defined community as broadly as most of the later literature on community archives has done. Specifically, people who share a self-ascribed sense of connectedness, and this may be manifested, for example, in a feeling of identity or in common behavior, as well as in activities and territory. Individuals can belong to more than one community. And while it seems very simple, there was heated debate on how that definition should eventually appear. The 2003 convention rarely uses the word communities alone. It is usually written communities, groups, and individuals, in recognition that ICH is safeguarded not only by communities, however defined, but also by groups and sometimes by individuals. And in our experience, archiving has the same diversity. Sometimes entire communities are engaged in creating an archive. Sometimes it is a small group within a community or from outside the community. And sometimes it is an individual assembling a collection.
Hello, I'm Shubha Chowdhury here from New Delhi. I will be sharing a few examples from my work, as Robert mentioned, with the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology of the American Institute of Indian Studies, ARC henceforth, which was established in 1982 with the primary objective of repatriating collections of recordings held in archives abroad. Coming to our discussion today, the ARCE had a project funded by the Ford Foundation called the Archives and Community Partnership Project, which had sites in 2 places in India, in Rajasthan and Goa, where we worked with communities to archive their traditions in ways that they wanted by consulting with senior elders in the community as well as young people, so that they led and planned the documentation process. Then the recordings were shared with the performers and to whom were given full rights. We had a project website, a mobile phone app, a CD series of which 25% was given to the performers and community, as well as programs on community radio. These were all examples at our attempts at doing community-based dissemination with rights given to communities.
The UNESCO 2003 convention does not mention archives of any kind, which is one of its weaknesses. Nations that are signatories to the 2003 convention are obligated to undertake extensive surveys of their country's ICH through inventories that are now called community-based inventories. But there is no discussion as to how all that information should be stored or by whom in order to support living heritage. It would have been very helpful had there been a statement on community control over the use of the materials collected in the national surveys. In our experience, the archives and communities are often managed by an individual or a small number of community members.
As we all know, member states are required to create inventories, as Tony just mentioned, but the format and extent is not stipulated by UNESCO. Research archives, such as the Peru example that follows, are in most cases best suited to provide an institutional umbrella for inventories of intangible cultural heritage. The methodology that is advised for the inventory relies greatly on audiovisual recordings, which increases the need for collaboration with archives with their ability to preserve and provide access to future generations, which is what the convention is meant for. If archives are to be given a more active role in the 2003 conventions, there needs to be support for community archives, as well as institutional or research archives. Research archives, in many cases already, work with communities, and there's been a great movement towards collaborative archiving, repatriation of archival materials to communities, and so forth. However, it is also important for institutional archives, such as us, to introspect and examine our policies, systems, and methodologies to see where we can apply the community involvement, if not community leadership, within our existing structures. To review the conditions for community involvement in inventory, it may be useful here to examine the stipulations of the convention and see if we as archives are able to incorporate these into our working structures. Identification of communities and groups and their representatives, ensuring that only ICH that is recognized by communities and groups is inventoried, ensuring that permission of communities and groups is obtained for inventorying, respecting customary practices governing the access to ICH, ensuring free, prior, and informed consent of communities and groups for nominating their ICH for lists of the convention. I think that the issue of recognition by the communities of their ICH and respecting customary practices is something that we all need to incorporate into archives today. However, there are practical challenges for archives to be able to incorporate these into their system, especially for legacy collections that have already come into the archive. It is, however, useful for us to use these as guidelines for the future.
In India and in much of South America, there are relatively few successful enduring archives of local communities, aside from high prestige or governmental institutions. This is very different from the situation in the United States and Canada described in the other presentations today. But we do find more cases of communities, groups, and individuals creating collections. A collection is not an archive, but it is an assemblage of materials. The people who assemble them are often unable to achieve their long-term preservation and accessibility in the face of various kinds of challenges, predictable life cycle of archives, the changing of the nature of interests of the groups, and especially funding and the life cycles of individuals. Communities often turn to more established archives for assistance. This can take the form of sharing expertise, sharing a collection for preservation, collaborating on documentation projects. And this is why we have titled our presentation Communities and Archives, rather than Community Archives. We have a new slide. Here's an example from Peru. The ethnomusicologist Raul Romero, who directed the Institute for Ethnomusicology at the Catholic University of Peru for decades, has written that almost every small town or city has at least one person in it who has taken it upon himself, all of his examples are male, to document the music and dance tradition of his region. These are self-appointed archivists and documentarians, and they use audio recordings, photographs, and video recordings, and they've assembled large personal collections that are locally recognized as experts about the local traditions. Their organization of these materials, however, is idiosyncratic, and there's no succession plan for them. They are often not in very good shape when they reach an advanced stage. And while these collections of a community's living heritage, they are not archives in the sense of being able to ensure long-term preservation for future use and long-term access. Romero obtained funding from the British Library's Endangered Archives program for 3 recovery projects of such collections, but there are many more out there. The materials were integrated into the Ethnomusicology Archive of the Catholic University in Lima, which is a long-standing archive in the region. The life cycle of an individual can determine when a collection requires archival collaboration. Every director of an archive is aware how often collections only come upon the death of a collector. Proactively seeking out collectors is a really good idea.
Well, we have shared many aspects of this with Peru. And in the past few years, ARC has received some large and very valuable posthumous collections, the scale and size of which are not possible to handle without special funding. We have managed occasionally to get small sums from the families concerned, but we do still have a big backlog awaiting digitization. We have in recent years received 2 grants from the Endangered Archives programs like the projects in Peru and the Modern Endangered Archives program to digitize and preserve a collection at a regional archive, which did not have the requisite archival infrastructure to preserve the very valuable collections of music, oral traditions, and folklore. This was in Rajasthan, an area where we've done a lot of work. The digitization and creation of metadata has not only created an organized archive at the regional local level, but has enabled making recordings available to heirs of performers and the community more generally. These collections are thus now accessible at the community, regional, national, as well as international platforms through these grants from the British Library and the UCLA Library.
I'll now turn to my own experience with the Quinceji Indians in Mato Grosso, Brazil, with whom I have been working and collaborating for nearly 50 years. I started recording them in the 1970s, and in the 2000s, they decided to establish a culture center where they would unite all the recordings, photos, and written materials made of and about them. Their community is very clearly defined. It's a language group, and also you can see its main village is a circular structure in which most events, public events, happen. And I was there recording by myself first, and then with very young children, and later with older ones. I was delighted when the Quinceji had that idea of creating a community center, and I had my early recordings all digitized and sent them down with documentation in Portuguese linked to the CDRs, and they immediately ripped the CDs into MP3 files. And they organized all of the files as they saw fit. It had nothing to do with my original tape by tape and then CD by CD organization. They used the materials in a number of ways, including in making their own films. And their reactions to the collection were generally positive and sometimes unexpected. Archives can be important. Recordings I had made of since deceased elders spurred a movement towards self-determination and a land claim for lost territory. One man said his father told me a story he had forgotten to tell his children that explained the relationship of other stories to each other. And yet there are, of course, problems of access. One young woman asked me for copies of her father's singing. When I asked her, why didn't you walk 100 yards over to where the archives are? And she said, well, one of the people there was her brother-in-law, and she couldn't speak in front of him. So access is not necessarily uniform in community archives, just as it hasn't been because of power and other influences on access to other kinds of more established archives.
Collaborative archiving with communities has been greatly enabled by digital technology that we've seen, which has become cheaper and more accessible in the past few years. Mobile phones in rural areas provide an entry point for digital technology as well as to the internet, and thus make it easier for us to train community members to use digital recording equipment. A recently concluded project funded by the US Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation, which focused on an endangered ballad tradition in Western Rajasthan in India, is an example of how young members of the musician community could be trained to use digital audio and video equipment. In this slide before, oh, sorry. Okay. And then supported through Zoom meetings using their mobile phones, even from remote rural locations. The Young Project Assistants covered about 200 villages in 3 districts. This is that. Each month, the recordings were deposited at a local archive and then onwards to ARC for preservation and archiving, with copies provided to all performers. I have the link here below, which takes you to an online database with sample recordings, metadata, and the documents created by the young members of the musician community. There's a downloadable project report on the same site.
This project that Shubha just spoke about is quite similar to the Library of Congress project that Michelle spoke about, but with adoptions for the specific nature of the place she was working. When I was preparing this paper, I did a search on Bing or ChatGPT for a list of the major challenges facing community archives. And the first item on the list was funding, followed by sustainability, access, control, documentation, and privacy. This list will not be news to any of you listening to us, but funding is not only the first challenge of community archives, it is a major challenge for more institutional and established ones as well.
ARC has been involved in a few initiatives of collaborative archiving and support of community archives. However, all of these have been enabled by funding from project grants, and thus there was no way to sustain these activities in any substantial manner, even though equipment and training was provided. Though some activity continued and some individuals have been able to make use of the training and exposure, they have not survived, leave aside, grown, or developed. Mainstream or institutional archives like ARCE do not have the means to support community archives except by providing,
I have it in front of me. Shall I
such
continue?
short-term project-based report, but can provide long-term preservation of the recorded materials and ensure community access, which can aid transmission and revival. Typically, community archives will not have the infrastructure or funds for preservation.
This has been mentioned by the others, but a key question in this is who should control how the materials are used? It's a critical issue in discussions of community archives and the relations between communities and archives. Most ethnomusicologists would argue that local communities should control the use of the materials about them produced by themselves or others. But who precisely is a community, and who therefore should make the decisions about the use of something? Some communities want to maintain control of their living heritage and seek an institutional archive to store their collections as a dark archive, whose contents are not listed in the catalog and whose access is not authorized to anybody. And this can make a great deal of sense for a community, but it can be difficult for institutions where access is ruled by institutional and governmental policies that guarantee access, and where the funding of digitization requires public access to what has been digitized. This is one place where the words in the title of our presentation, flexibility, trust, and collaboration, are required, and it can take time to resolve them.
It is thus left to archives, or their directors more specifically, to develop and implement ethical principles and policies for access and dissemination, and keep the relationship with communities alive, so that the changes in technology or laws do not end up creating hurdles or block access. Giving an example from ARCE, we have in the past few years been encouraging scholars and depositors to ensure that the performers and heirs always have access to their collections, or to a community where relevant is also assured access. The ARC has also provided researchers with letters that they can give the performer or community members, stating that the recordings are deposited at the archives where they will always be accessible to them. We've recently amended our agreement form with depositors to reflect these changes.
The Smithsonian Institution's Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage has developed a statement of shared stewardship, which is a bit of a tongue twister, for the collections in its Ralph Rinsler Archives and Collections. And this document has been praised and recommended for adoption by other Smithsonian units. And I believe there's a link for it there. It will be easier to accomplish with new materials than with older ones.
Though there is a varying degree of success and there are many challenges in establishing community archives or partnership with communities, it can only be seen as a positive direction for archives to follow. Subaltern studies, bottom-up documentation, the UNESCO Convention, and other movements have resulted in an attitudinal shift towards the recognition of community ownership, acceptance of the fact that documentation and archiving should be led by the community and not mere involvement or participation. Sorry, okay. Today, we do not think of community members as informants or subjects, is one way that we can see that this is true. I'm sorry, I'm losing my space every now and then.
If you'd like me to take over, I can read your part.
I've just got it, I think.
Okay, as we support.
Yes. As we support and appreciate this direction, sorry about this, we also need to examine to what extent these initiatives are actually top-down in effect. How often is the initiative from the community, and to what extent do we as scholars and archivists think that it should be so? In my years as an archivist, there have been many positive interactions and outcomes of working with communities, but there have been occasions when members of a community were not interested in having access to their documents or recordings, have no use for them, and sometimes are merely tolerating what they see as our well-meaning efforts. We're equally guilty of perhaps creating ownership when none exists, introducing financial parameters which are not part of a culture at times. Once more, a top-down attitude, however ethical the intentions may be. As researchers and scholars, we are also interested in studying how communities recognize and define cultural genres, what their attitude to rights are, and so forth. The number of academic publications on these topics in the past few years are surely testament to this. In conclusion, it's perhaps useful to remember that just as the nature of ICH, that is constantly changing, communities also are not static and monolithic and will constantly change. So will the roles of all kinds of archives. Technology and changing attitudes will propel us in new directions at a hitherto unexpected pace. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Tony. Let's see if you could just stop sharing your screen.
I will, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, here we are. We're back again. And thank you for, extraordinary presentations. Shubha and Tony, I think you really got to the heart of the matter about issues of community-driven archives, community-centered archives, how one engages with community, and some of the issues, many of the issues at play there, and some of the entanglements and challenges, but also some great triumphs. And also, Tony, I love the way you talked about the collections that are held by private individuals and how to jump across that gap, how to enable people to deposit their and learn how to deposit their materials in communities. And I think that one of the issues is demystification of archives, that there are basic practices that people can learn that aren't intimidating. As one who's been intimidated myself, but I've tried to jump over the barrier. So our next presentation is by Marina Czerniawska, who's the digital archivist at the University of Alberta Archives, Libraries, and Museums. And Marina is going to be talking about folklife archives and the archival Multiverse, just by way of introduction, Marina is the leader of the working group on archives for CF International Society for Ethnology and Folklore. She's a bureau member of the section on University and Research Institution Archives, International Council on Archives, and she's a scholar of archives as well, which dealing with topics that include community archives, folklife archives, traditional knowledge, and memory keeping. And she's in the process of completing an interdisciplinary PhD on unorthodox archiving practices. And maybe we'll hear about some of that unorthodoxy, Marina. So please take it away.
Thank you, Robert. One moment. Here it is. Thanks again, Robert, for this kind introduction, and thank you to the American Folklife Center for having me. I'm honored and humbled to be among such stellar presenters. And to tell you a secret, Andy Collis and Michelle Caswell are my personal heroes. Special thanks to Michelle Stefano and Robert Barron for creating this space for us to learn, to share, and inspire each other to continue our work in a respectful and, dare I say, in a radically kind way. I would like to start with my positionality. I was born and raised in Ukraine, but I'm grateful to live, work, and learn in Amiskwaciy-Waskahikan, also known today as Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, on Treaty 6 territory and Region 4 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. I'm a professional. I like to say that I'm an archivist with folklore training. I work at the University of Alberta Archives, where my focus is primarily on digital archives and digital preservation. But before 2023, for over a decade, I worked as a folklore archivist at the Cool Folklore Center, which is a research center at the Faculty of Arts, University of Alberta. I'm a researcher of what I call unorthodox archiving practices. And as Robert mentioned, this is the focus of my doctoral project. I acknowledge and recognize that all these layers influence how I think about folklore archives, archives in general, and about cultural heritage, and how I approach my archival practice. In my presentation today, I would like to present a slightly different perspective from previous presenters. I don't need to talk about ICH, that's been covered extensively. I would like to focus on the role of folklife archives in the preservation of and access to intangible cultural heritage. I will start with talking about folklife archives in general, and then provide some examples from the CF Working Group on Archives. Although folklore archives may not fit the definition of community archives, and there are many, of course, but folklore or folklife archives have been working with communities for decades, if not longer. As many of you know, folklife archives can be found under different names, folklore or folklife archives, and I'll be using these interchangeably today, ethnographic or ethnological archives, cultural heritage archives, and any other combination connecting the concept of cultural heritage with the concept of documentation. The American Folklore Society, when describing its National Folklore Archives Initiative, emphasizes archival materials in its definition of folklore archives. They are unpublished, multi-format collections of materials created in the field that document traditional cultural expressions and knowledge. The description of the folklore archives offered by the Working Group on Archives of the International Society for Ethnology and Folklore defines them first and foremost as institutions. And what unites them is that they all document experience, knowledge, and cultural expressions from living people. Catherine Borland, whom some of you may know, director of the Center of Folklore Studies at The Ohio State University, positions folklore archives somewhere in between institutional archives, national archives, those that we associate with control and power, and extracting practices, and community archives, which are usually radical and liberatory. She calls folklore archives bottom-up archives. Folklore archives are often part of research institutions, and they're normally managed by folklorists rather than professional archivists or other information professionals. Although folklore archives in North America, at least, have been around for at least as long as mainstream archives, they're largely absent from the professional and scholarly archival discourse. But before yes?
Rena, sorry, I think your screen share hasn't loaded. We'd love to see any images you're showing. So if there's a quick alternative, we could show it. Sorry?
What do you see now?
I just see a URL on the screen. I think the rest of us do too, unfortunately.
It's a black screen that says loading.
Oh, no. I was sure you were following my slides.
Well, we were following you for sure, but not the slides.
I'll try to stop sharing and share again. And I have a plan B if that doesn't work. And nothing again, right? Okay,
Right.
I'll go to my plan B. I have a PDF presentation.
Okay, great.
I'll just set it up to show exactly. So you haven't seen all my pretty pictures, have you?
You can zip through them pretty quick if you like, and then come to your point where you are now.
I'm just trying to, all right. So this is the river where I live and work next to it. I talked about this, and this. Before I discuss in more detail how Folklife Archives work to safeguard cultural heritage, I would like to mention a very important statement developed by the International Society for Ethnology and Folklore that was approved in 2019. It's a statement on data management in ethnology and folklore. The statement, it's a position paper which aims to support researchers of ethnology and folklore. It recognizes that archiving is a very complex issue. It centers individual experiences. It recognizes that materials generated during the field work are heterogeneous, they're multimedia and often non-standardized. They recognize that research data is co-produced by researchers and community contributors or research participants. The informed consent is a key principle of this statement, and it's also a living document. It is emphasized that informed consent can change as relationships between researchers and community contributors develop. And importantly, this is a dynamic document that can be revised and updated as necessary. Is it moving for you?
Yes.
Yes, we're good.
Yes, thank you. While everyday life and traditional knowledge are a significant part of human knowledge in all cultures, it rarely comprises part of the official history. According to Barber and Moraes-Farais, it is left out of the official historical and cultural discourse. Folklore archives are well established as sites for preservation of traditional cultural expressions. They have a long history of documenting marginalized groups, everyday life, women's and children's activities and views, and histories that have so often slipped between the cracks. They enact cultural sensitivity, scholarly tradition of reflexivity, careful attention to ethics of fieldwork, and treat the community being studied as primary creators of records. Folklife archives help recognize, acknowledge, and honor different worldviews, belief systems, and ways of documenting and preserving the present for the future. Just slightly moving this. Okay. For the last 6 years, I've been serving as a co-chair of the CF working group on archives. It's a wonderful group of colleagues with whom we meet at CF congresses and sometimes also in between. There are over 60 members and many more subscribers to our listserv. We organize conferences, we collaborate on projects and publications, and the most recent project we just completed is a series of folklore archives webinars that are all accessible on our YouTube channel. So I would like to share with you 2 examples of Folklife archives who are members of this group and how they work with communities, how they engage with communities to preserve their cultural heritage. There are many more examples, but considering the time constraints, I picked 2 that are different in their, the projects that I'll be talking about are slightly different, but they also show how Folklife archives employ innovative practices to safeguard and document cultural heritage. So the first example is the Elphinstone Institute Archives. It's part of the Elphinstone Institute at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Its holdings comprise about 4,500 hours of audio recordings, 700 hours of video, as well as photographs and manuscripts. The topical thematic content of the collections is very diverse. It includes all kinds of aspects of cultural heritage, but important aspect of their work is that they're not so much interested in the text, so not so much in the text of the song, for example, as in why the person is singing the song, and this is reflected in the interviews that they record. These archives are accessible by appointment, and Nicholas, my colleague Nicholas Vigor, manages this archives. So the 2 projects that I would like to talk about are projects of engaging Folklife of the engagement of this Folklife archive with communities. And although a lot of the holdings were generated through fieldwork conducted by the faculty associated with the Institute and students, there are also donations that come from the public, from private individuals, or generated through projects like these. So the first project is Prejudice and Solidarity Archived Through History, or PATH project, which is a community-led project that was coordinated, it's still ongoing, is coordinated by Grampian Regional Equality Council and LGBTQ+ community group for Pillars, with the aim of explore ethnic minority and queer community history in Aberdeen and record interviews with the community members in order to preserve this heritage for the future, for the community. They also work to explore what other materials related to their community can exist in different archives in Aberdeen and try to build links between all of these materials. The second example of the project is Voices, the Community Story Project, and this project had a goal to capture stories of what they call New Scots, people who had come from somewhere else and were now living in that particular area. And again, Elphinstone Institute Archives was a partner on that project. So I would like to share some of the reflections that Nicholas shared on about this collaboration. So he says community can be used in many different contexts with different meanings and intentions, and recognizes that community as a term is so important for folklore archivists and in the context of Folklife archives. He seems to always seek to understand what community means for his community partners rather than imposing his folklorist definition of the community on them. He believes that we have to make room for other people's understandings and be careful, understanding that their resources are limited, that most community members that participate in the projects do it on a volunteer basis, that they have other things in life, and that it is important to have community partners lead and shape the project. And he adds that we all could spend some more time listening to our community partners. The second example of the Folklife archive that I would like to share is the Cork Folklore Project. It's an institution, organization that is community-based, founded in 1996. And it was established as a partnership between the University College Cork and Northside Community Enterprises. They also have Department of Social Protection pay to employ community researchers on a part-time basis, those who have been long-term unemployed or who live with addiction or mental issues. The core function of the project is to collect, preserve, and disseminate archive of oral history and folklore within Cork, and they do it through recording audio interviews. They currently have over 1,000 recordings that cover different aspects of life, including working life, leisure, social change, health, and so on. Collections are open to the public by appointment only, but because by its nature, this project is community-based. It constantly engages with communities by recording traditions and folklore and sharing these recorded materials with the people of Cork. Cleona O'Carroll, my dear colleague and friend, is a research director in this institution. Cleona employs slow methodologies in her work. She tries to take time and make space for in-depth exploration of topics. Recently, her focus also shifted to more diffused place-based inquiry rather than being defined by a topic or even life narrative that still has a finite conclusion. And she says it's surprising what comes up when people are not rushed, when they can speak slowly and communicate slowly. She keeps thinking, and it's something that's been discussed within the working group on archives a lot, the specificity of folklore archives holdings, their long-term linear nature, their cultural and local specificity, richness and evocative power, intimacy, messiness of daily lived experiences, and so on. She insists that folklore archives should act as full partners when dealing with granting agencies, for example, in societal challenge-focused projects, because we have a lot to contribute in terms of insight and other views onto meaning-making. And these are just two examples of projects that they've been working on that involve listening, recording interviews, describing these audio materials, disseminating them in a curated form through the website, and also they try to always link excerpts of interviews to the original record in their database so that it can be recontextualized. Cleona's observations, slow methodologies remind me of the slow archiving framework. The principles of slow archives are accountability, engagement, relationality, and reciprocity. Such approach emphasizes respectful relationships, listening carefully, and acting ethically. Folklore archives have deep understanding and long-term experience documenting and sharing traditions, taking into account diverse perspectives on what is important to the community to be remembered and preserved, and what is important to be forgotten. They take into account collective ownership, ethical implications of disseminating folklore materials in a digital world, how to ensure that the context is preserved. They advocate for unofficial, non-elite, sometimes marginal culture and its role in place in what should be known about human experiences generally and what will be known tomorrow as history. They're well equipped to contribute to the safeguarding of cultural heritage. Folklore archivists know that context is paramount and stories matter. There is no doubt that folklore archives have an important role to play in the archival multiverse, and I hope that we learn to recognize them as important contributors to the documented record of human experiences. And I have some references here, and thank you very much for your attention, and many thanks to Cleona and Nick for sharing their experiences with me.
Thanks so much, Marina. This is such exciting and innovative work, and rethinking the whole nature of archives. Existential issues about what archives are about, and thinking of archives as active agents of fieldwork and documentation, and thinking about what that encompasses beyond something that's item oriented and very materialist, and looking very specifically at objects. So this really points to some great new directions. I'm pleased to introduce now my good friend and colleague, Andy Kalavas, who's Andy really directs a model archive serving the people of Vermont that is extraordinarily well integrated with the Vermont Folklife Center's mission of serving the people of Vermont, of field research, of public programming, of engagement, and also he's done some terrific co-curation work, but there's been full credit given to community partners on publications. He's also a scholar of archives, as are so many of our speakers today. And he's did a dissertation on archives as well. He's also been an active member of the archive section of the American Folklore Society, which is a networks archivists throughout the U.S. who are involved in folklore archives, and has been involved in some important collaborative projects. So if you're a member of AFS, we'd like to encourage you to join the archive section. If you're a member of CF, to join the archives working group, and it's easy to join, and they're both great professional organizations. So Andy's presentation is called Public Folklore Collaborative Documentation and Ethnographic Archives. So the floor is yours, Andy.
Thank you, Robert. As Tony sort of said, to be prepared for a little multiple people covering the same topics from their own perspectives. So buckle up for that, folks. One of the things I'll say is that Marina is my hero, and I'm very happy to be here with many people who I view as heroes. There is never a downside in my mind to sharing the stage with people who are smarter than me. I'm going to run a slideshow of just some pictures, so you don't have to look at just me while I'm talking at you. So that should start now. And these are basically just a selection of images, some of which relate indirectly and some directly to what I'm going to talk about. So what I want to address is a little bit about the kinds of collections I worked with, both generally and specifically in relation to Vermont Folklife, and how we at Vermont Folklife connect to the individuals and self-identified groups represented in them. How we do our best to be a community-driven archive responsible to the individuals and groups who are documented in it. I'm going to start with the general. The Vermont Folklife Archive, from my perspective, emerges from a particular archival tradition. Collections created through the work of ethnographers, and in particular folklorists and ethnomusicologists. Following the convention established by the late Jerry Parsons of the American Folklife Center, I refer to these materials as ethnographic collections or ethnographic archives. In contemporary terms, ethnographic collections most often consist of audiovisual documentation, including photographs, video, sound recordings, and text records, manuscripts, field notes, administrative documentation, stuff like that, that simultaneously serve as records of the activities of the field worker and records of the cultural practices, memory, and experiences of the people with whom the field worker engaged. Above all else, these records generated through ethnographic research projects emerge from the social interaction between the people behind the camera and the microphone and the people they interview, record, and photograph. Ethnographic archives are fundamentally products of human communication and social relations, and they are the sum of the actions, attitudes, perceptions, and values of all those involved in the process of creating them. At their inception and beyond, ethnographic archives were generally established along disciplinary lines, using what Marina cited, and I love the term, unorthodox archival methods. And so they're not really archives in the sense meant by professionally trained archivists today. Rather, they were, and in some cases still are, collections created and maintained primarily, although not exclusively, for the purpose of preserving the informational content of documentary fieldwork records in order to facilitate future use of them for research and programming. And they tend to be organized idiosyncratically, or in line with models developed within the disciplinary confines of folklore studies and ethnomusicology. Beginning in the 1980s and 90s, a result in part of increasing archival professionalization at the American Folklife Center, as well as the efforts and interests of others in the field, such as Ellen McHale of the New York Folklore Society, concepts and approaches employed by professionally trained archivists, for example, the concept of provenance, the idea that materials generated from a particular source should be kept together to maintain information about their original context and use, the use of controlled vocabularies, and traditional modes of archival description, such as finding aids, increasingly came to influence practice in these disciplinary collections. These days, ethnographic archives often have as much in common with collections organized and managed in accordance with archival principles as they do with the disciplinary research collections from which they emerged. They are hybrid collections shaped by cross-disciplinary practice. Turning to the specific, since 2002, I have served as the archivist of the Vermont Folklife Archive, an ethnographic collection of roughly 6,000 audio and video recordings of interviews and music, approximately 25,000 still images, and several hundred feet of manuscript material. The majority of our holdings have been and continue to be generated by the staff of the organization. Beginning with research materials created in the late 1970s, the archive documents regional cultures, cultural practices, traditional art and music, memory, experience, continuity, and change in Vermont in our broader geographic and cultural region. The collection includes the voices and music of Indigenous Vermonters, the multi-generational descendants of early colonial settlers, 19th and early 20th century immigrants from Francophone Canada and Europe, later immigrants from all over the world, and new Americans who arrived in Vermont as refugees. In addition to these internally generated materials, we hold many donated collections focused on related topics that have been given to us by ethnographers, academics, community scholars, photographers, journalists, and others. These donated materials consist of recordings and other records created from the 1940s to date. On one hand, the Folklife Archive is a record of the work conducted by the organization and its founder, Jane Beck, from the late 70s up to the present. In short, a collection of institutional records. From another perspective, the archive preserves records of human experience in Vermont, those of the individuals and self-defined groups with whom Vermont Folklife staff engage. In this way, it's also a documentary collection of perspectives on life in our state over time. We often refer to the archive as the heart of the organization. We view it dynamically as a fully integrated living component of Vermont Folklife's efforts that guides and informs our research activities and is continually drawn upon in the creation of new programming, such as exhibits, podcasts, documentaries. It's not simply a site for storage and preservation, but a manifestation of our mission, a beacon whose presence allows us to reflect on Vermont folklife's past and inform our actions and activities into the future. In this way, the three building blocks of our efforts, research, archive, and programming, are intertwined and mutually reinforcing, reflecting, enacting, and ultimately embodying the unfolding ethics that guide us, the methods we employ, and the nature of the content we share with the wider world. The content of the collection also serves as a record of our changing perspectives over time, a roadmap to what mattered and matters to us and the partners with whom we work. Over the last several decades, in line with changing perspectives in our fields, we've moved away from older priorities that emphasize self-directed and self-selected projects and programming, and increasingly focused on community-driven and community-based inquiry and public programmatic outreach, and most importantly, collaborative approaches to research, media production, and programming. Sidestepping the complexity of the word community, I've increasingly come to view the Vermont Folklife Archive as community-driven or a community-informed archive, something distinct from the idea of community archives as expressed in the archival literature. And Flynn, Stevens, and Shepard's defined it this way. The defining characteristic of community archives is the active participation of a community in documenting and making accessible the history of their particular group and or locality on their own terms, close quote. I say this because although many of our archival holdings, particularly those generated in the last 23 or so years, were created through varying degrees of collaborative processes with, quote, the active participation of the community in documenting, close quote, cultural practice and cultural experience, we are still the repository. Even when individuals or cultural groups define and set terms for access, which certainly has happened historically for us, we hold custody of the records, manage them, generate the metadata, and ultimately grant access to them or not. Unless otherwise specified by the donor or interviewee, our release forms and donor agreements grant us non-exclusive rights to the content, while commercial copyright resides with the interviewee. We reserve rights for the broad category of educational use, scare quotes intentional. When we have appropriate permissions, we incorporate material from the archive into our programs. So this is all sort of pretty standard to the way archives have worked historically. It's not that different. I say we're community driven because we are directly responsible to the individuals, and in some cases, the groups, the cultural groups, families, occupational groups, regional populations, organizations who are represented in the collection. In our work, be it research, programmatic, or archival, we have one central goal: to present people to the world as they see themselves, to represent human experience from the perspective of the people who lived it. As such, when we want to incorporate content shared by an interviewee or performer into our programs, we share the proposed content with them ahead of time, ask permission, and get approval before proceeding. If we want to edit recordings for inclusion in exhibits or a podcast, we share the edits to be sure we have accurately represented their intentions. When an individual documented in the collection has died and there are living close relatives, we reach out to them. When we have questions about cultural context or the personal or cultural sensitivity of content, we reach out before making use of it. Just because we have physical custody and certain legal rights does not mean we own the stories and sounds shared with us. These forever belong to the interviewees and performers who shared them with us, and in many cases also belong to the larger cultural communities and families of which these individuals are or were a part. There's a whole lot more I could go into on this topic, particularly as I sidestepped a while ago, the murky idea of community and what that means and doesn't mean. So I hope we'll have a little bit of time to talk about that today a bit more. For now, I'm going to switch directions and talk a little more detail about community engagement in our archive by discussing the the Revitalizing Franco-American Song in the Champlain Valley of Vermont project, an effort to bring Franco-American song materials in our collections out into the world in partnership with Franco-American community members and performers. More than 20% of Vermonters trace their ancestry to Francophone Canada, the result of large-scale immigration to the United States from roughly the 1840s to the 1930s. Although many Franco-Americans in Vermont do maintain ties to Quebec and Quebecois culture and the French language, for many others, these connections have gradually diminished over time. The Vermont Folklife Archive holds several collections of French language song manuscripts and audio recordings created by families in Burlington and Barrie, Vermont, from the early to mid 20th century. Beginning around 10 years ago, working with a range of partners, Vermont Folklife set out to explore ways to build increased access to these materials in our collection. This broader effort focused on digitizing and making these materials publicly accessible, and focused on three things. The first being language and its relationship to cultural identity, the intersection of language and music in lyrical song, and contextualized cultural engagement and revitalization through archives. Due to the time constraints, I'm going to speak to the third point, archives as sites of cultural engagement and revitalization, but I'm happy to address the other aspects later on if there's interest in time. Work on the Revitalizing Franco-American Song Project began in 2018 as an effort to actively engage an audience with one key aspect of Quebecois cultural practice, communal singing, and foster continued engagement with this practice in Vermonters of French Canadian heritage and beyond. Our work was inspired by what still amounts to a somewhat disputed premise around here, that Franco-American cultural heritage is a central aspect of the culture of Vermont, rather than just an adjunct to it. That the culture of Franco-Americans here is Vermont culture. Building off our earlier efforts with Franco song material in the collection, we worked with two Franco-American culture bearers, pictured here, Kim Chase on the left, and Carmen Baudouin Bombardier on the right, and with musician and scholar Lisa Ornstein to draw on the Vermont Folklife Archive and personal and family resources of Baudouin Bombardier and Chase to develop a repertoire of songs that they would then teach over 6 weekly free singing schools at Baudouin Bombardier's house in the fall of 2018. To support the classes, we created a website, pictured here, that includes recordings of the pair performing the songs, as well as musical notation, French language transcriptions, and to support those of Franco-American heritage and others who don't speak French, phonetic text to aid in pronunciation and English translations to make the content accessible, all prepared by Lisa Ornstein. The Revitalizing Franco-American Song in the Champlain Valley of Vermont project allowed us to take what once were lyrics on a page in an archive in Middlebury, Vermont, and work with culture bearers to frame and execute an effort to revive and revitalize them as music. By bringing together Francos and non-Francos, we hope to educate about a potentially unfamiliar cultural context while seemingly stressing the potentially unrecognized familiarity of much of the culture from which it emerged. Taken together, we took a small step in a larger effort. By contextualizing Franco-American music within a discourse of the traditional music of Vermont, rather than as distinct from it, we began to assert the centrality of Franco-American experience in shaping the culture and history of the state, and do so by fostering community-based connections to our holdings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was really a great presentation, and you had some really dazzling slides. I hope you put them in the archive there. So we have some nice chunk of time for discussion and Q&A, but we're going to start with the panelists themselves. And panelists ask questions of each other, something more you want to say that responds from the questions, and we'll take it from there, and then we'll look for some Q&A from others in the in our big audience, in our globe girdling audience. Tony, you have a question, so please.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to the presenters. They were wonderful papers. I have one observation and a question. The observation is that there has been absent in this discussion any mention of the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, and also the Association of Recorded Sound Collections in the United States. And there are archival organizations that are dealing in important ways with this and collaborating intensely with each other and with other archives. The ICTM, the International Council for Traditional Music, is actually meeting with YASA in Turkey starting Sunday. That's an example of how ethnomusicologists and archival organizations are working together. My question is this. Both of you were presenting on folklore archives. And my question is, do you see folklore archives as as growing and expanding, or as actually diminishing and being less and less funded and having less and less autonomy. In ethnomusicology, I'm sorry to say that increasingly ethnomusicology archives are being placed in libraries as special collections and not really kept with anybody doing new projects. And so I wonder about folklore archives. Is this something that is growing, or are we seeing a decline of archives around the world?
Marina?
I can start. I think the situation with folklore archives is very similar to ethnomusicology archives, unfortunately, but it also depends on the country and on the specific context. In North America, from my Canadian point of view, I see the programs merging, folklore degree granting programs merging with other programs, and therefore, if there are no researchers, there are no scholars leading it, there is the archives then yes gets deposited and absorbed by a university library, let's say. And it's not the worst scenario, because it can get lost if it's not. However, I think in Europe the situation is a little bit different. Not that they don't struggle with funding and they have to apply for grants every now and then, very regularly. But some of those institutions are supported by governmental funding as part of the Academy of Sciences or as part of other national memory institutions. So they still continue doing research. It's very niche, but in a way they are reinventing themselves, I would say, and the work they're doing is just wonderful, just absolutely amazing. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Marina said. My knowledge is limited to the United States, and it's the similar situation. One of the things about folklore organizations in the United States is that often they're either connected to arts commissions, or they're independent nonprofits, and all of them struggle to maintain the collections, to maintain access to the collections, and a lot of them are, as Marina said, going to higher ed institutions or historical societies.
So, any other questions from the panelists?
I have a question to both Anthony and Shuba and Andy. Anthony, I'll start with you. You mentioned during your presentation that the recordings that you deposited, that you donated to the community, the collection was all rearranged and it was a different collection. I imagine in an archival world, it would be a no-no, of course, but in a folklore archives world, we can look at it as something positive. We can look at it as a truly living collection. And I'm wondering whether for you as a creator of those recordings, if you would like to see the collection as it was yours, documented, including its structure, linkages between its components and things like that. And then the description of the new collection presented somehow available to the end user, side by side, the original and the new collection. I'm just thinking how whether this approach would make you feel better, and whether you would find it beneficial for the materials themselves and for the communities that use this material. And for Andy, it's a simple and difficult question, I guess. In your doctoral dissertation, you called out the necessity to conceptualize folklore archives. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, how much of that has been done since 2010, since you defended, and how little, and what needs to be done? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I was actually delighted that they ripped them all and made their own organization. As long as somebody can find what they're looking for in Indiana using other parameters, I think it's great. I also think that they mostly put them onto small thumb drives, and they disappeared. So I don't really know if there was a single form of organizing them. The material was dispersed just massively throughout the community, and I think that is how it should be.
Yeah, I'll address that too, because I think that's just wonderful, you know. And I like if I were stewarding a collection like that, right, I would have zero problem with people reorganizing it. I would also keep the original stuff too, because that's you know, my archive is crazy. But I just think it's wonderful that people can do that and should be able to do that. It's about meaning, right? And it's about context, fundamentally for archives. So
Absolutely, and new meaning making. Yeah. Thank you both.
yeah, your other question is gigantic. I don't even know where to start with that. And I guess just for the sake of having something to say, you know, that things in the cultural heritage sector in the United States are uncomfortable financially. And the impacts of that on all sorts of practice are real, you know. And I guess one of my goals in the consulting work I do is to try to encourage people to think about these collections as central to their programs, you know, and not just a dumping ground for the stuff they've generated. And from that perspective, right, I think there's been a change, right, that people are thinking more actively about these materials and how they relate both to the history of the programs and organizations they're part of, but also what else they can do for the world. You know, and the problem is always access to resources, you know, and the need to do these things on a grant-funded basis from one grant to the next without any guarantee that you'll get the next one, you know. If I'm understanding your question, and if I'm not, please elaborate. You know, I think so much has changed in the last 13 years, and I'm glad, you know, and the work you're doing, Marina, is key to that, right? Like, and your colleagues internationally is just blows my mind, you know, and it gets me thinking in all sorts of new ways. And that's like, I loved this panel because it was just great. You know, you guys just opened my thinking to all sorts of stuff, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciated Tony's use of AI to answer a question. That was great. But I don't, am I getting at what you're asking, Marina, or am I missing it totally?
No, I'm grateful for this answer, and I know it's gigantic, and I hope we can meet for coffee or
I would love
beer
that. No.
and continue that.
I would love that. Yeah, but thank you both. Thank you all, you know, for your involvement in this, and for providing another window for me to see this stuff through. Always appreciated and valued.
Yeah, in the United States, we have, as Andy mentioned, we have a pretty large network of state programs, Folklife life programs, nonprofit organizations, and locally based organizations that have generated a great deal of material. There are efforts underway. Andy mentioned the New York Folklore Initiative. They recently got money from CLEAR, funding from CLEAR, and CLEAR, Council on Library Information Resources. Some of our nonprofits in the U.S. have received funding from that. I believe you did, Andy, and I think maybe the American Folklore Society did. So I would think that CLEAR is a resource, and NEH is also a potential research, at least speaking about the United States. Certainly, again, returning to UNESCO ICH, it should be part of the funding and absolutely intrinsic to support that's given for inventorying and documentation, as is occurring in over 180 countries. This is you know, such an opportune moment to infuse any work in inventorying with archiving as inextricably tied to the process. So I see that we have a couple of questions from our esteemed audience. We have three now. So the first one is from my old friend Ellie Shodell. Hi, Ellie. Is there an accepted vocabulary for adding folklife data to historical spreadsheet columns? So would one of the panelists like to answer that?
From my perspective, I guess it depends on what's meant. For controlled vocabularies for description of content, there's the ethnographic thesaurus that was developed by the American Folklore Society and is now managed by Library of Congress. So that's a structured vocabulary. And I don't know if that's the question. I don't know, Marina, you have any?
I'm not sure what is historical spreadsheet. I assume it's some kind of metadata standard or descriptive standard that is used in historical archives.
But Ellie says to add to the database is what she says. In the chat.
Well, I would repeat Andy's recommendation for the ethnographic thesaurus. We use it extensively, and it doesn't fit. I know many folklore archives complain that it doesn't perfectly fit their holdings because of the specificity of locality and practices, but it's the best we have so far.
Great. Well, thank you.
Yeah, and Robert, one other quick thing is that, for some things, there are our own kind of convoluted reference works like the Tale Type Index, or, for folk tales that people do use. That's a bit of a challenge to navigate if you're not familiar with it. But also for things like traditional English language song and Quebecois song, there are reference works where these songs are numbered and documented that allows you to tie a variant or a version of a song to some sort of standard accepted notion of the song. So we'll often use child's ballad numbers to identify a song. We'll use laws numbers to identify a song. And this project we've been working on with Lisa Ornstein, a longer term one, is using some Quebecois resources or Francophone Canadian resources, not just Quebec. But that one's a maze to me. So
yeah, these responses, the great responses, the question and the conversation really makes me think that we need more cross communication between the ethnomusicology and folklore communities. We have had a large number of documentation initiatives in the past 50, 60 years, 40, 50. And the ethnomusicologists have done a tremendous amount of work in their academic research. It's more situated, I think, within academic institutions, but I think we're operating under parallel lines. I'd also like to call, Michelle will be sending around references in a couple of weeks with a blog about the event, but I particularly want to single out the Oxford Handbook of musical repatriation that Tony had contributed to. And it's exhilarating to read, and it has just a lot of great information on repatriation and on archives and contemporary thinking about archives. So I have another question here from Clegborn Rice. Marina, can you say more about informed consent as a living document? Changing the contents of an informed consent document would belie the term informed, wouldn't it?
Yes, and thank you very much for this question. And I see that Sarah answered it in the Q&A. The document that I was referring to, this statement, CF statement on research data management, it's a very brief document, and it was purposefully created in a very brief form because folklorists needed something to refer to when they were, dealing with granting agencies or with publishers or what have you. So it's the first iteration of this document, and we actually started conversation. Our working group on archives started conversation with the CF board about potentially reviewing it or revising it. But Sarah's answer is on spot, and it is becoming more and more acceptable, and it kind of echoes what we were discussing with Anthony. What Anthony was saying about him donating his records and them being changed. This living characteristic of folklife collections is evident in the form as well, in the informed consent, as much as in the material. I don't know if it answers your question, but the link will be shared to the statement, so you can have a look at that.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. I see by the old clock on the wall that it's half past the hour, and we probably span about 10 to 12 time zones here, maybe more. So we're having a break now. We're going to keep the webinar open. And but I won't eat lunch on camera. And I want to thank everybody and stay tuned. We'll begin in half an hour, and enjoy your breakfast, lunch, tea, or dinner break, as the case may be.
So it is 1 p.m. on the East Coast here of the United States, and we will get started with our second panel. And I just want to give some housekeeping notes for those who are just joining us now. Just so you know, the event is recorded, and that also includes the chat and Q&A entries. We will be having a Q&A and discussion period after all presentations in this roundtable. I also kindly ask you to direct your questions to the Q&A feature that's in your Zoom dashboard on your screen, and not the chat. And of course, you can indicate the specific panelist to whom you'd like to ask your questions. We will, and I'm moderating again. Well, for those joining, I'm Michelle Stefano. I am a folklorist here at the American Folklife Center on the research and programs team, and I will be moderating this panel and also the Q&A feature, as well as my colleague Alina Magoni is also here at the center. And we are trying out something new within that Q&A feature. You are welcome to thumbs up or upvote others' questions so that you can raise them up, in popularity and prominence for me to see more easily. And the chat is open for commentary, but again, we ask you to direct your questions to the Q&A. And my colleague Alina will also be posting any web links and resources that are related to what's being discussed in the following presentations while they are being given. So that takes us to the second and final discussion panel of today's Community-Driven Archives event. I'm happy to say we have yet another very distinguished panel of guests, professionals and scholars with extensive experience in community-led documentation and archival preservation efforts. So we will be continuing to hear about dynamic and fascinating examples of community-led archival work from the US as well as in Kenya. And I do want to just note that it is possible Dr. Patrick Mondu, our final panelist today, will not be able to present, although his colleague Lucy Kariuki will be doing that for him. So we welcome her in a little bit. And to set the stage, I don't think there's anyone better to set the stage on the topic of community archives and all the processes and considerations and issues that come with that topic and an area of activity, Professor Michelle Caswell, who will be laying down some foundational concepts for community engaged archival work. And again, setting the stage, I would imagine, so beautifully for all the presentations to follow. So without further ado, I will be now stopping the sharing of my screen and introducing Professor Caswell as she gets ready. So Professor Michelle Caswell is a professor in the Department of Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she co-directs the UCLA Community Archives Lab. And in 2008, together with Samit Malik, Caswell co-founded the South Asian American Digital Archive as well, an online repository that documents and provides access to the stories of South Asian Americans. And I do want to just note that fuller information on each of our panelists, including Michelle, is on the event program, and those resources are being put in the chat. So Michelle, it's such a pleasure to see you today, and take it away.
Thank you, Michelle, for that. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really great to see you again, Michelle. Today, I'll be talking about community archives and liberatory memory work, the view from Los Angeles. I could talk about community archives all day. I will not today. We'll talk about community archives for 15 minutes, I'm aiming, and I'm really excited to hear what the other panelists have to share about their important work. So as Michelle said, I'm co-director of the Community Archives Lab at UCLA, and I co-direct the lab together with my two newish colleagues who are fantastic, Tuivo Dang, who's an oral historian, and Tanya Sutherland, who does work on Black digital archives. At the Community Archives Lab, we do work in support of, together with, and alongside community archives, really hoping that community archives are driving the research that we're doing. And as Michelle said, I'm also the co-founder, together with Samit Malik, who's the executive director of the South Asian American Digital Archive, which is an online-only post-custodial digital archive documenting the history of South Asians in the United States that I helped to co-found 15 years ago, so back in 2008. And all of my theorizing, all of the concepts that I'll be discussing today have really been forged through the work with SADA as my primary research site, and SADA remains my primary research site. So let's talk a little bit about what are community archives. And I was excited to see in the earlier panel that some panelists were citing Andrew Flynn, Shepard, and Stephen's definition of community archives. We had a long conversation at the UCLA Community Archives Lab about what our definition of community archives are. And at our most basic, right, in our broadest possible definition, we agreed that community archives are independent memory organizations emerging from and coalescing around vulnerable communities, past and present. And there are some key words here that I want to draw attention to in this definition. The word independence is really important, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And then also this issue of vulnerable or vulnerability, I think gets at the heart of power. And I think it's really key when we talk about community archives that we highlight those two things, so independence and vulnerability. And I'll talk more about that in a second. I have a picture here of a fantastic community archive in Los Angeles called the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, which is located in 2 different houses and a garage. And the garage is like chock full of materials documenting the history of the Chinese community in Los Angeles, which is a history that's at least 170 years old. The garage is full of things like broken pottery from Chinese workers who worked on the railroads, which take on a new light as a record in the context of a community archive. So that's a broad definition of what a community archive is. I think we need to be really specific, though, in our conversation. And so the term that I prefer, which is very clunky, I admit, is independent, minoritized, identity-based community archives. And I stress independence here in that they're not part of a university or government agency, right? They are independent. And along with that independence comes both autonomy and often a struggle for sustainability, right? So that's, I think, really key in talking about community archives. And then this idea of a minoritized community in which the history that is held in common is that of a minoritized identity. And this could be based on racial, ethnic, religious, sexual orientation, geographic, linguistic, and other kinds of marginalized or minoritized identities. I like to think of independent, minoritized, identity-based community archives as grassroots collections in which those who have been left out of mainstream archives document their own histories. And again, power is central to this conversation, right? It's those who have been left out of mainstream repositories, out of mainstream histories, who really spend the considerable time and effort to maintain their own collections. And with that comes autonomy, right? So I think about the disability rights slogan from the 1970s, nothing about us without us. And that is key for these minoritized identity-based community archives. In most cases, it is the people who whose record it is, right? The people who are the subjects of the records are also doing the archival work in these independent community archives. And I distinguish this from community-centered or community-driven collections at larger institutions. And those are extremely important. I do not mean to downplay the importance, but the issues of sustainability and independence and autonomy are different for these minoritized identity-based community archives that I'm really being specific here and talking about. And I also want to distinguish these organizations from many, not all, but many historical societies in the US, which are often also independent community-based collections but many of whom, not all, but many of whom are invested in kind of a white supremacist narrative about their particular neighborhood or location as a way to bolster investment in their property values, right? And so I'm not talking about those kinds of organizations. I'm talking about those that are based on minoritized identities. So, that was a lot of language and a lot of specificity about this broader phenomenon that we're talking about, which is, community engagement in collections. When I think about minoritized identity-based community archives, there are some principles and practices that come into mind. So autonomy is key, participation. So active community participation in the stewardship of the collection, right? So in every aspect of the archival endeavor, from appraisal, digitization, description, and use. I think of this notion of shared stewardship. So rather than have a moment where there is a transfer of custody from the creator of the record or the collector of the record to an institution, it's instead an ongoing relationship in which responsibility is shared with all parties who are involved. I often see a multiplicity of voices in these collections and a multiplicity of formats. So things like a shard of pottery at the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California might not be seen as a record, or might be seen as a museum object, perhaps, by a more dominant institution, but that shard of pottery becomes a really important record of a community in this context. Also, many of these institutions and organizations are activist oriented. They're run by organizers, and they're very outspoken and clear about their political commitments. There's also a lot of reflexivity that comes with this practice. So people who are doing the work of community archives are actively reflecting on their practices and theorizing in their own right the work that they're doing. Many of these organizations value people over stuff. So the stuff is important, but only in as much as it catalyzes relationships between people, past, present, and future. And then also explicitly valuing affect or emotion in the work that they're doing. And I think all of these principles and practices really challenge dominant Western archival practice, which is in and of itself shifting in part in response to these principles and practices that are emerging from minoritized identity-based community archives, which has been really exciting to see over the past 15 years, the way that dominant archival theory and practice has had to change in response to some of these emerging for the dominant world theories and practices, which have been theorized for centuries, right, from the communities in which they emerge. I think along with this independence comes varying degrees of autonomy, right? So community-based archives often struggle to raise enough money. Some of them are all volunteer run because they don't have the resources to pay staff, right? So things like, money to hire staff, annual budgets, space, ownership or custody of materials, decisions about staff, or if the organization is all volunteer driven, decisions about appraisal, description, outreach and access, policy, and areas of focus. All of these areas are driven autonomously by the community, right? But then there is that trade-off where so much time has to be spent thinking about long-term sustainability, right? But always it's the community that is the subject of the record that is also making the decisions. And I want to make that distinction between this kind of collecting and more extractive collecting from dominant institutions, which are now very interested, right, in engaging with minoritized communities, but don't yet fully have the practices that are indeed willing to share power with those communities. So I want to give you some examples from Southern California along this continuum very quickly. So this is La Astoria Society in El Monte, which is in East Los Angeles. It's a 2-room building that is mostly volunteer run, that has an amazing collection of materials related to what was until the 1970s predominantly Latinx farm working community. And they do amazing collecting, amazing exhibition work, amazing user engagement on a very limited budget. The June L. Mazur Lesbian Archive in West Hollywood also collects materials related to the history of lesbians, not just in Southern California, but sort of nationally. Again, amazing work. I think they have 1 or 2 paid staff people, and the rest is all volunteer run. The Skid Row History Museum and Archive. This is in downtown Los Angeles. I love that this is in a former nail salon, and they left up that layering of the initial nail salon sign and then just placed underneath it Skid Row History Museum and Archive. This is a fantastic museum and archive that documents the history of Skid Row as a way of asserting, yes, history exists in Skid Row. Communities have lived there for centuries, and really asserting the importance of that community in the face of gentrification. And then the Social and Public Art Resource Center collects the history of documentation of murals in Southern California. This is the muralist Judy Baca's organization. Again, just an amazing history of activist murals in California and around the world, in fact, that they're documenting. And then finally, the South Asian American Digital Archive, which is not based in Southern California, but a lot of the work that the organization does is to document the history of South Asians in California, which is one of the, the first places that South Asians settled in the United States. So why does any of this work matter really quickly? It matters because the materials are being activated for really important reasons, for what I call representational justice, which is important, and also material redistribution, which I think we need to focus more on. So this is all outlined in my book, Urgent Archives and Acting Liberatory Memory Work, which is freely available for download, open access on the Routledge Press website. When I talk about representational justice, I'm talking about countering the ill impact of what is called symbolic annihilation. So symbolic annihilation is the ways in which members of marginalized groups are absent, grossly underrepresented, maligned, or trivialized by mainstream media. This equally applies to mainstream archives, right? So community archives are really powerful affirmations of what I call representational belonging in the face of symbolic annihilation. So what I mean by that are the ways in which community archives empower people who have been marginalized by mainstream media outlets and memory institutions to have the autonomy and authority to establish and act and reflect on their presence in ways that are complex, meaningful, substantive, and positive to them in a variety of symbolic contexts, including records documenting the past and the present. And so this is really, I think, language to talk about the impact of these community archives, right? That in the face of symbolic annihilation, they assert, I am here, we were here, and we belong here. And these are important aspects of representational justice. I think we are starting to have different language in the field to talk about the impact of the work that we do. And one key term here is liberatory memory work. And I think there's 2 sort of really important components of liberatory memory work. The first is that representational aspect that I just talked about. But secondly, and I think more importantly, or most importantly, is that we need to make sure that the work we're doing is resulting in material shifts, in material conditions and lived experiences. And I'll leave you here with a quote, and this is a quote from 2 colleagues, Doria Johnson, Jarrett Drake, and myself, who represented the United States in a dialogue that was run by the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And we said that memory work should be dangerous. It should seek not only to acknowledge past trauma, but to repair it. It should aim to upend hierarchies of power, to distribute resources more equitably, to enable complex forms of self-representation, and to restore the humanity of those for whom it has been denied. So those are big tasks. And so, I pin a lot of work on community-based archives, and I feel like these organizations are up to this task. So I will end there. Let me stop sharing my screen. And I look forward to hearing the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I have a whole lot of questions in my mind, and I'm sure others do. And if you do, you're all welcome to direct them to the Q&A. But in the interest of time, we will move on from Los Angeles to Baltimore now to welcome Dr. Ashley Minner-Jones, who is a community-based visual artist, curator and folklorist from Baltimore, Maryland, where she has lived on the same block her entire life. Her interdisciplinary practice is deeply rooted in place, usually within the context of the U.S. South, and is focused on honoring and celebrating everyday people by lifting up their stories. Her most recent project is a reconstruction of East Baltimore's historic American Indian reservation. A monograph on the same is forthcoming. I can't wait for that, Ashley. Ashley currently works as assistant curator for history and culture at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian here in DC. So Ashley will be talking about that project, revisiting the reservation of East Baltimore. And so Ashley, please take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this event. I can tell I'm in amazing company. It's an honor to be here. I'm gonna give you all a short version of a very long story that more people than me could tell. In many ways, this project has become my life's work, and it certainly predates my time at the Smithsonian, although I'm here with my Smithsonian hat on today. The place now known as Baltimore is part of the ancestral home of the Piscataway and the Susquehannock people, and many more indigenous peoples have passed through or stayed here from time to time. I hope everybody by now is aware of this great resource, nativeland.ca, by which you can look up, I think at this point, anywhere in the world to see who the indigenous stewards of a place are or were. And up until a few years ago, if you looked up the entire state of Maryland, it would say Piscataway. And by the way, the Piscataway are alive and well, mostly in southern Maryland today. As a nod to the importance of archival research, a colleague at Johns Hopkins just a couple years ago unearthed this document at the Maryland State Archives that shows that it was actually the Susquehannock who ceded the territory that would become Baltimore to the colony of Maryland in 1652, just sitting there. So it may surprise you to learn that the largest group of American Indian folks in the Baltimore region are not indigenous to Maryland at all, but we are the descendants of a very diverse group of ancestors who come from a wide swath of territory as far north as the James River in Virginia and as far south as the Great Peedie in South Carolina, and fleeing disease and colonial warfare. Prior to the establishment of the United States, we coalesced in a place in southern North Carolina, today known as Robeson County, and became a cohesive group that since 1956 officially has been known as the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. We take our name from the Lumbee River, which winds its way through our tribal territory. You can see it's pretty dark and murky, otherwise known as Drowning Creek. And what doesn't look like the river in the swamp looks a lot like this. It's still a very rural agricultural farming community. I snapped this picture of a tobacco field myself some years ago. Today, it's more likely you'll see a field of soybeans or some other crop. But in my mom's youth, this is a family photo. My grandma, my two uncles, and my mom, probably my grandfather, took it in the early 1950s. Many Lumbee families found themselves dispossessed of their tribal homeland through the Southern agricultural system, and they were sharecropping, which means your whole family works really hard to farm somebody else's land for very little return, and it was a difficult existence. My mom sometimes doesn't like it when I show this picture because she says it makes it look like they were so poor they didn't have clothes, but it was just summer. They did have clothes. See, they had clothes. And this part of the world also had become the Jim Crow South, and in Lumbee tribal territory there was tri-racial segregation, 3 separate school systems, one for Black kids, one for white kids, one for Indian kids, 3 sections in the movie theater, if you can believe that. So it's just a tough place to live. Lore holds, and it is true, that Lumbee soldiers coming back from World War II, like my grandfather here, passed through major cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, Detroit, and found out it would be way easier to work in a factory than crop somebody else's tobacco. And so there was a mass exodus in this time. And the most popular destination was Baltimore. My grandfather did not care for Baltimore City. He went straight to Dundalk, which is where he's standing here and where I live currently and have lived my whole life. That's where that block is, just southeast of the city. Thousands and thousands of Lumbee Indians including my grandfather's father, settled in this area that bridges the neighborhoods of Upper Fells Point and Washington Hill, such that they started to refer to this area as their reservation affectionately. There's no official reservation in Baltimore, where they could find other people who looked like them and talked like them and understood where they came from, because Baltimore then, as it is today, was understood to be a black and white city. And here came all these Indians from the South with Southern accents and curly hair, and they didn't look like anything like the Indians on TV. And, you know, they were understood. Baltimore had its own challenges. The arrow on this map's actually pointing to where my great-grandfather was living when he died in 1948. And the main drags of the reservation were East Baltimore Street and South Broadway. And he was living on a street that no longer exists. So here are some Lumbee ladies standing at the corner of Baltimore and Broadway. Our people started to have more access to different technologies. Like you see all the cars in the background, their hair's all fixed, they have nice clothes. Also in Baltimore to this day, there's like a bar or a church on every corner. It's very different than Robeson County, which is still almost a dry county. There was some precedent for Lumbee people settling where they did. This is Dr. Governor Worth Locklear, who was an 1893 graduate of Baltimore University Schools of Medicine, which, as it turns out, was like right across the street from the reservation a couple decades before. And he also turns out to be a relative of mine, and maybe the earliest Lumbee in Baltimore. He's the earliest one I found so far. And this just proves what we know about how ethnic communities form in diaspora, where relatives will like go check out a place and then tell their relatives, and then more common. Pretty soon you have a whole neighborhood. So in this neighborhood, Lumbee Indians, who are pervasively Southern Baptist or Methodist, established South Broadway Baptist Church, the Baltimore American Indian Center, which is where I spent a lot of time growing up and working with young people. And in my lifetime and theirs, I was born in 1983, we had the church, the Indian Center, this daycare across the street, and then stories of places that just live on in infamy, like the Volcano Bar that used to be at the corner of Fairmont and Ann. And it was an Indian bar owned by Greek folks, and they said it was so violent, it used to erupt every weekend. And if you go to this corner today, you can't tell where the bar would have been, but we know that it was there because we're still hearing the stories. So I started to offer a very short walking tour of the Indian neighborhood as I knew it, you know, like 3-4 stops, because that's all there was in my lifetime, which started at the church. The first time I tried to do it formally, along with me was Sister Linda Cox, who is also Lumbee, who is the daughter of a founder of the Baltimore American Indian Center and probably the most enthusiastic member of South Broadway Baptist Church, who still lives in the neighborhood and who has been living there since the 60s. And I was like, Sister Linda, you should lead this tour and I'll just help with the logistics because you know way more than I do. And she said, yep, that's fine. So because she was so excited about sharing with the community about our culture, who we are and our history, she spent like half an hour in front of the church, and I started to worry we weren't going to make it to the other 2 or 3 stops. And I said, Sister Linda, you know, we should walk up the next block to the Indian Center. And she said, yes, you're right, let's go. So we didn't make it more than 10 feet. We stopped next door in front of El Salvador restaurant, where she said, wait, don't you want to tell these people about the Indian store that used to be here? And of course I couldn't, because I didn't know anything about the store. It was gone before I was born, and she had to educate me. So then I started to think, how could I find out more about what our community used to have here? Obviously, with anywhere from 2,000 to 7,000 Indians in this little neighborhood, we had more than a church and the Indian Center and the daycare. And so I convened my elders to ask them, what did we used to have? And I got really excited because for once I found something in the archives that actually said the Lumbee community in Baltimore. I found this official, institutionally produced 1969 map that had a few places that I didn't know about on it. And I said, yes, I found the reservation. So I made a lot of Xerox copies and I passed these out at our gathering. And I was like, look, isn't this so great? And they were like, no, it isn't. It's all wrong. Just check out their faces. And I said, well, could you mark up the map? Could you add what's missing or fix it? And instead, they decided in conversation that day to go from memory, block to block, alley to alley, and reconstruct the reservation of their youth on the other side of the map. And this is an example of what they came up with. And you can kind of just see the difference in the volume of information. Also, if every one of these squares is supposed to be a city block, you kind of can't tell where things used to be, which is what I told them. And they said, you should have made a big street map and we could have marked it up together, which is what I tried next time. And here's Antoinette pointing to where she used to live when she first moved to Baltimore. But even still, I was having a hard time correlating what they were telling me should be there with what I know from living there. So I said, you know what, I'm not going to understand this until we all just go down to the neighborhood and you point at what you want me to see. So that's what we did. So here's Sister Linda pointing to a place where Lumbee Indians have physically inscribed themselves into the neighborhood. This is a block on Broadway Pier. And then here's Aunt Jeanette, who told me to pull over in a place where I wasn't expecting to pull over, to point up into a park and say, this is where I lived when I first came to Baltimore. And I'm like, lived in a park? And she said, no, it used to be all apartment housing here. So what this caused me to realize was that the entire neighborhood had been transformed through urban renewal in the early 1970s. Here's an aerial shot, and that's the park Aunt Jeanette was referring to. And it was the heart of the reservation, the north side of the 1700 block of East Baltimore Street. So that sent me back into the archives, like, I am going to prove all this stuff existed. And to my surprise, I found us everywhere in the vertical files at the Enoch Pratt, in the Baltimore City archives. Here's slides of the Indian Center. Sanborn fire insurance maps have been incredibly useful. And most exciting were images from the periodical archives, like here's Sister Linda's mom in the News American. My husband's grandmother in the first photo of unprocessed images from the News American that I found. The Indian Center, when it was a much more vibrant place, Indian education when it first started, the Citizens for Washington Hill, who actually fought against urban renewal. And there is Rosie Hunt, another Lumbee person in the center. And at the front left is Miss Betty Hyatt. You remember Aunt Jeanette pointing up into that park, which is called Hyatt Community Park. Betty Hyatt was a Ukrainian American activist who assembled that group. And it's the reason we have rent-controlled housing in that part of the city to this day. The Volcano Bar, the only image I ever found was in the Afro-American, the longest running African-American newspaper here in Baltimore. And this is a date from the original racial uprising following the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. And this is an African-American man who got beat up at the volcano. However, from what we know about the volcano, you didn't have to visit it during a riot to get beat up. You could go on any regular day. And I found the bouncer from the volcano here also in the News American archive. This is Clyde Oxendine. And from a lot of this work is based on oral history. So I was able to interview 2 retired Baltimore City police officers who said when they would get a call about the volcano, they wouldn't even go in. They just stop in the street. And this guy would be in the doorway and he'd say, I got it. And they're like, okay, you got it. So here's the intertribal carryout, which we had even in the 90s. Today it's Tacos Jalisco. I'll tell you a very quick story about why this work matters. This is the McKim Center far up on East Baltimore Street. I know it looks like it's in Greece, but it's not. And in the 1950s, they hosted youth sock hops. It was the dawn of rock and roll. On one fateful evening in 1957, Aunt Jeanette went to a sock hop, and so did a photographer for Ebony magazine who was working on this article, Baltimore's Mystery People. And Aunt Jeanette was 14 years old. She attended this dance, and to her surprise, later her picture appeared in this article called Mystery People of Baltimore, neither red nor white nor black. Strange Indian tribe lives in world of its own. And I brought this to Aunt Jeanette, and she's like, oh yeah, that really hurt my feelings when it came out because it says we don't know who we are, and I know who I am. However, look at these great photos. This is the evidence we have of young people enjoying the reservation in its day. And because Aunt Jeanette told me where this picture was taken, and she's still around, and she's the person in our community that I bother the most about everything, I was like, Aunt Jeanette, let's go back to the McKim Center. And she gets frustrated with me sometimes. She's like, you expect me to remember things that happened 70 years ago? Yes, you will remember, Aunt Jeanette. So I bring her the actual magazine home. I found it on eBay, and you can see how upset she is about it today. And then we go to the McKim Center, and suddenly she realizes where she was standing, how she was standing, and even remembers what music she was listening to, because our stories are embedded in these places and they are embodied by us. And when you reunite us with our places, it reactivates our heritage. One more very quick one. My friend Tammy posted this picture of her mom in tribute on Facebook. Her mom died like 30 years ago. And I said, oh, hey, Tammy, I recognize that headband from a picture in the News American. Is it the same one? And Tammy said, yes, that's actually me. And do you have any more pictures from that shoot? I said, well, there's just a couple more, and I don't think it's anything you'd be interested in. It's just some guys dancing. And she said, oh no, that's actually what I want to see. Could I please see? And as it turns out, Tammy was most interested in seeing this picture of her mother in the background. You see Tammy there with the headband and her mother's in front. And she said her mom didn't dance very often, but she did dance that day. And she just really wanted to see her mom's dancing feet again. So by going into archives, we were able to repatriate Tammy's mom's dancing feet. And now I'm going to go very quickly show you what came of all this. We have now a print illustrated guide to East Baltimore's historic reservation. It's available for free in cultural institutions around town, or if you write to me when I have some. We have BaltimoreReservation.com, which is everything I found, some 60 sites now, archival and contemporary photographs. We have the Guide to Indigenous Baltimore cell phone walking tour apps, co-produced with Dr. Elizabeth Rule. And then finally, we started getting a lot of press, and Tiffany Chavis, a librarian who's in the audience, saw it. And also my prior institution, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, agreed to let me make a new archive, the Ashley Minter collection, we're working on a shared stewardship agreement with our community. And Tiffany, who was an MLIS student at the time, was like, I want to help work on that. So here we are during the pandemic with another community member, Stanton Lewis, processing the first additions to the Ashley Minter collection. Tiffany and I and Stan then went on to curate a photo exhibition that's also part of BaltimoreReservation.com from the archival photos. There's baby Stan at the daycare where the Indian Center started. This is older Stan working on the mural at the Indian Center. This is a picture of some of Tiffany's relatives who her whole entire family look like movie stars. And Slim Hunt, a pillar of the community who is now among the ancestors who felt like he had to dress up like a movie star in 1966 to be recognized for who he is. And then here's a picture of some little Lumbee kids that neither Tiffany nor I knew, but we picked them out of the archives immediately because they're our people and we see us. Here's the exhibition title. You can find it on BaltimoreReservation.com. And that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Ashley. That was profoundly touching and fascinating as well. I love just so far with the two discussions so far. We're taking these notions of representational justice, the need to combat symbolic annihilation, and then we're taken into the inner view and inner working of a community collaborative process, and the funny stories that come along with that, and being told that you're wrong with the map, and just the steps in creating a truly community-led project to safeguard this heritage and make it more known. So thank you. And we'll be back on that. So I'm going to move things forward and introduce another distinguished colleague and panelist, who is Junius Brickhouse, the founder and executive director of Urban Artistry, Inc. And I will say Urban Artistry was also a recipient of one of the AFC's community collections grants in 2022. Junius will be talking to us about harmonizing heritage, my time with two Piedmont blues legends, and the codes that define us. So I do believe you'll be presenting some ideas on guidelines for collaborative work, which is really exciting. And in terms of Junius's illustrious experience and background, again, I direct everyone to the link to the event program to read more. But Junius is an internationally recognized scholar, practitioner dedicated to the sustainability of hip hop cultures. As a researcher, folklorist, cultural ambassador, mentor, and logistician, Junius currently serves as director of Next Level, driving the strategic direction of the program's cultural diplomacy and global conflict transformation initiatives. And as I noted, is the founding executive director of Urban Artistry, Inc., where he produces projects such as the International Soul Society Festival, the Preservatory, which is part of the Urban Artistry, and the Urban Artistry Digital Archives, which all encourage artists to research and document tradition bearers and their contributions to the larger cultures. So Junius, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I appreciate that introduction. I'm happy to be with everyone here today. I'm logging in from Lagos, Nigeria, and there's a dog, and dogs are important. So I apologize if my connection is a little bit wonky here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I can. I think I've been on the call since the beginning, and I've heard just wonderful presentations, and I'm happy to be a part of this today, and most importantly, to talk about these two amazing human beings and my work with them. But I think it's important to start off by saying the work didn't begin as I didn't intend to do a collection. I wasn't trying to create an archive of sorts. What I was trying to do is I was trying to find a little bit of information about the context of acoustic country blues and what it meant to hip hop culture. In a lot of ways at Urban Artistry, as the founder, a lot of my mentees and my students, they look to me for professional growth and guidance in a lot of ways. So the Preservatory Project is kind of our arm of trying to document our communities responsibly and to tell our stories. And without this project, we probably wouldn't have found the Library of Congress, and I wouldn't be here speaking to you today. I think a good place to start is in this idea of me as a dancer wanting to connect with people from traditions that preceded us. My research is primarily in music and movement in the African American South. And as a folklorist, I spend a lot of time in multiple communities. Phil Wiggins and I had the opportunity to meet through a good friend of ours at the Maryland State Arts Council that knew that him and I both were working on projects that we were trying to connect the old with the new, to do intergenerational work with hip hop culture and also with acoustic country blues. And I, as a person who loves blues music and loves to play harmonica, decided that I would do an apprenticeship with Mr. Wiggins through the Maryland State Arts Council. Now, I said that I like to play the harmonica. When you meet or you listen to to Phil, then you know that I don't play at all. I just draw and breathe into the thing. He plays harmonica. But more than anything, the work started with us building a friendship and a relationship, and it turned into something different. And I think this entire talk is about what do you do when it becomes something different, when it's no longer, you don't have the permissions and you don't, it's not in the best interest of the collaborator to move forward and be documented and archived in that way. What does that look like? And I would be tested on that time and time again, as we all are. But it was different with these communities of elder, specifically Black men, and who were National Heritage Fellows and known in a lot of ways, but in their own communities, meaning not their professional communities, their families. They were just Phil and John D. And that changed my work, and that made it something different. Phil and I are still close. We still work together. I dance in Blues House Party, which is a project that he does. And I have so many accolades, but I'll save those for later. An amazing human being. Phil was ever so kind to also introduce me to John D. Holman. John D. Holman, I don't even know where to start. My research ever since 1995 was to find buck dancers, particularly from African-American communities. And it wouldn't be until 2015 that I'd be able to do that. And it was tough. All of those years, spending time in communities, talking to family members who did not want to talk about the pejorative nature of what it meant to be a buck dancer to them. But when I met Phil, he talked to me about a documentary that he was in called The Blues House Party, and that John D. Holman, a buck dancer, was in there. In that documentary as well. This was a very happy moment, and I was elated to have the opportunity to meet him. And I would, collaborating with a good friend of mine named Rebecca Connolly in North Carolina, we were able to contact John D. And the goal was to learn something about movement from him, understand where his mind worked, how his mind worked, excuse me, and what he was trying to say in movement. But being in his 80s, he no longer danced anymore, but he had the memory of what he meant to do. So we scheduled a meeting, and I think the first time we met, we ended up moving mattresses and, and talking for 2 hours about music and about dance and about growing up to parents who were raised by formerly enslaved people and how that informs movement. And I knew at that time that this was going to be a different type of work. So I kind of got my things together and kind of refocused and centered. It would be about 2 years before we even pulled out a recorder or a camera to start documenting. And this is what John D. needed. This work was not supported, or excuse me, funded by an institution. It was supported by myself, Urban Artistry, and friends that wanted to help and support this growth. John Dee passed a couple of years ago, but we did and we were able to amass a collection, and we are, and that collection is at about 78 assets, video, documents, and also instruments that we are now talking to this family about how do we do that responsibly. I'm talking about these people that impacted my life so much, but I'm also thinking about the process and what it took to get to that. And all of these years that we worked with John Dee and, you know, my time with Phil Wiggins, what are some of the things we focused on? And those are some of the things I want to share with you today. Most of these, the Collaborators Code was something that we came up with, frankly, as we started to make mistakes. And those mistakes were cultural, right? We were an integrated group of people working with a community of people that had different needs. And being a part of hip hop culture, we did not understand what it meant to be a part of traditions that, frankly, are not as popular in our communities. So we had to do a lot of things differently, and we had to build trust, you know, and these are some of the things that helped us build this code. The first thing was that integrity was non-negotiable. When we wanted to be honest about what we were doing, and John Dee specifically came from an environment where he didn't have a lot of trust with people. And I'll say this out loud because I think it's important. I think often people believe that I had access to these communities because I'm Black, but I will say out loud, my Blackness doesn't make me informed. I have to go out, I have to do the work, and I also have to learn. I have to be a student, I have to be kind, I have to be the type of person that's deserving of the time that these beautiful people spent with me. So I won't read all of these line by line. I think it's important that you can see them or screenshot them. I didn't invent kindness or responsibility, so I don't have a problem with sharing these with people. But I will tell you that, again, that I'm not pushing to say that I am perfect, and as an organization, we did this right. But these are the things that we learned how we could do better. So when I think about the reflections, these are some of the things that I reflected on. You know, after we started doing the work, and there were some pauses and some breaks, and say, okay, let's decide where do we go from here. Let's check in with our collaborators and see where they're at and what they want to do moving forward. I think the most important thing, the first question I asked myself, well, who are these people to me? you know, after the period of performance, you know, like it wasn't the goal that was important, it was the process. And I learned that really quick working with these gentlemen. And how do their families see them? Like what does it mean for us to have this, all of this collection, all this work, all these assets, and how do we make sure that the family is involved, especially with an artist like John Dee, who's no longer here to represent himself? I think it's important to ask that question. And what does it mean, you know, to be a steward of this information? And, you know, and all that time we spent together. And last but not least, you know, is this my work to do? You know, am I the right person for this? How does that information live in me? How do I ensure that not just me, but the people who look to me for professional growth and guidance are now a part of this continuum of this information, of these experiences that I've had with these National Heritage Fellows. So I think my time is about up. So I can go on and talk about these wonderful human beings, but I think I'll end it here and thank you all for holding space and for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Junius. And you may not have invented kindness and respect, but putting it into practice, especially in the context of this kind of work, is not necessarily the norm, is it? So thank you for sharing that. And we will now move on to Lucy. I believe you'll be speaking for Patrick Mondu. And in terms of the presentation, it's actually a really interesting example in that it bridges this work in community guided documentation and archives and the UNESCO world that we have talked about earlier in this event, in that the project that I believe, Lucy, you will be focusing a bit on was recognized by UNESCO in its register for good safeguarding practices. So it's one of the lists, an international list for recognizing intangible heritage. And it's 1 out of 3 lists. And I believe it's the least popular list that state governments nominate their intangible heritage to, because it relates to actual safeguarding projects. So I cannot wait to hear about the work that you all have been doing. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm delighted to join this discussion. As you have heard, my name is Lucy Kariuki. I work together with Dr. Patrick Maundu at the National Museums of Kenya within the Kenwick department. And we have been working over the years on the promotion of traditional foods and also documentation at the community level. So I will start off some of the work we have been doing. I hope everyone can see my slides. Let me just do slide. You can hear me, Michelle?
Yes, everything looks great. You just made it perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just look at some of the ways we have been documenting some of the knowledge at the community using traditional foodways among different Kenyan communities. As you know, so our focus has been mainly in Kenya, which is in Eastern Africa. And just to give an introduction, the National Museum, we have been collaborating with different partners to champion documentation and promotion of these traditional foodways. And this, we have been trying to develop different protocols to ensure that we empower the local communities so that they can be able to do their own documentation and be able to keep it in their own archives. So one way of the methodology we have been using is engaging the local communities, for example, the youth of school-going pupils, that is between age 10 and 13 years. And we also engage the youth at the village level. And this we do using digital technology like cameras, smartphones, and also so that we are able to add into the modern communication channels so that they're able to gather information and be able to share this information. And from this, we are able to gather information on what are the cultural practices in terms of songs, taboos, ceremonies, seasonalities that are associated with different foods that were consumed and are being consumed at this time. And then this information, we try to ensure that is kept within the community level so that it can be passed on to the next generation. So today we'll be focusing on some of the projects we have been conducting. One, as Michelle has pointed out, was the successful promotion of the African leafy vegetables in Kenya. This was an ongoing project since 1999, and it's still ongoing. Now we are at the documentation level, where we are trying to empower communities to be able to keep the information at the community levels. So this is still ongoing. And then we have also done a lot of work on safeguarding the diversity of the bottle gourd. This we work with some women groups in the eastern part of Kenya, which is called Kitui. And then also we have been using the food waste protocol in schools, where we are engaging the pupils 10 to 13 years, where they document some of the foods that they consume, and I'll go through that later. And then we have also been working together with the British Museum to document endangered foodways heritage of the baobab tree. So I'll start off with the successful promotion of the African leafy vegetables in Kenya. And this one, as I've said, we started it a while back. And what we did was we looked at an inventory of the local vegetables that are in the communities. And then we looked at what are the priority ones. And those are the ones at the moment, we promoted during that time. And then this helped to remove the stigma which was associated with some of this vegetable. And one of the stigma was it was associated with poverty, that this was food for the poor. And we were able to alleviate that. And during that time, we realized that there were more than 210 traditional vegetables that were in existence in Kenya. And at the time, only 3 exotic vegetables were mainly sold in the market. Very few traditional vegetables were sold in the market, both the supermarket and also the open air markets. And during this time, we found that like only a small percentage of these African leafy vegetables were being cultivated. Less than 2% was being cultivated. The rest was in the wild and was being harvested from the wild. So we wanted to at least promote these vegetables so that the percentage of what is cultivated could increase, so that we are able to also safeguard what is in the wild and to ensure that there is no, we don't lose this biodiversity. This is some of the things we did. We went through different communities in Kenya, where we looked at what are the different vegetables that are available, and we found that different communities had different types of traditional vegetables that they were consuming, and then we were able to document this. And as you can see, most of these vegetables were being safeguarded. The knowledge was mainly with the women. And so what we did is we first, after documenting the different vegetables, we also needed to find out how to prepare these vegetables so that they are more utilized at the community level, because we found that the knowledge of preparation was with the elderly generation and not the younger generation. So we wanted to learn the recipes So the older women will hold the community group meetings where the older women would teach the younger generation about how to prepare some of these vegetables. And then we would do the documentation, video documentation for further referencing for the community. And then we would do the vegetable promotion at schools, hospitals, and also we would do different media messages in TVs and radios. And then to just ensure that at least from the community level they benefited from this consumption, we try to link them to supermarkets so that they can improve their livelihoods through supermarkets, restaurants, and also schools nearby. And this is one of the community groups, women groups, where we worked with them, where we provided the seeds. Then we gave them, they were able to grow and show them agronomic skills, and then they were able to grow and connect them to the supermarket. And during even this, as you can see behind, there's a building. On that building, they had also like a seed museum where they were able to keep some of their local seeds so that they're able to distribute or to at least make sure that they don't get the different local diversity does not get lost. And this is a picture of how we were able to improve like the shelves of the supermarkets. We were able to see that there were more, the traditional vegetable became more included in the supermarket and became like a high-end product in the supermarkets. And then the next project we also did was also safeguarding the Kitete, which is the gourd, by also another women group in Kitui, the eastern part of Kenya. So this is the eastern part of Kenya. As you can see, this is the Kitui County. Is considered a bit semi-arid, so it's a bit dry. And one of the, as you can see here, is also the main people who have this knowledge are the women. So because they consider this bottle gourd as a form of food and also as a cultural utility. And because you find that there were like two types of bottled gourd. There's the edible type and the container type. So this edible type, they're able to consume. They're also able to consume it as food. And then the container type, they're able to use it for storage of different things. And they can either use it for seed storage, milk storage, porridge storage, and also they can cut the calabash into half and use it as a bowl or a dish for consuming either the porridge or for even eating food in it. And then they can also sometimes use it as a chicken house, as you can see in one of the photos. And sometimes they even decorate the gourd, and looks very beautiful, as you can see in one of the photos. And these can also be used for storage of other, even sometimes there's these other bigger gourds they use for water storage. And the water is usually very cool and cold, especially in areas that is a bit hot. So it becomes very, very much in handy. And when the gourds, they have different ways of, for example, if the gourd becomes broken, instead of throwing it away, they have a way of they repairing it. So they're able to stitch. There's like the traditional method of stitching the broken calabash. And then on the other side, you can see how they tie the bigger calabash. They can use it for carrying either water, porridge, and they can travel with it to longer distances, especially in traditional the culture. Sometimes during marriages or ceremonies, there was requirements. For example, they were asked to bring these traditional brews, or they were asked to bring porridge or something like that. And these were the best containers to use to carry, because the liquid inside would maintain a certain temperature. It would not become too hot. So this was a very like good storage material which they used. And how we documented this was done through interviews, community interviews, and then we used tape recorders, we did video recording, photos, having group discussions and also demonstrations. And also with this, they were able we are able to find that there were nearly 200 Gua types of land races, and with approximately more than 70 different local names, which were able to document. And some of these calabashes were either used they can sell it to other people in the community. And also, as you can see on the other side, this is how this is a calabash, the container gourd, and inside is the edible gourd. So you can see that they're using both types of gourd. One, they are consuming it, and the other one, they're using it as a dish or as a bowl. And at the end, they were able to establish a museum, a community museum, where they were able to, where they have all the different types and shapes of gourds. And this is still within the community, at the community level, with the women group, where they're able to, like, when they do the different cultivation of the calabash, the gourds, they keep in this museum to make sure that this culture continues. So what we found is that this group, they were able to collect and distribute varieties of edible and container gourds, and they were able to at least share the knowledge and skills from, of course, from the elderly women and now to the younger generation. And this is we also have the documentation of the 200 land races in a 700-page document, which is stored at the Gourd Museum at the Resource Center at the village level. The other project we conducted was the food waste documentation using schools in 12 communities in Kenya. And this one, we used the school approach, where we tried among different communities in Kenya, where school pupils, with the help of their teachers, they were able to document food waste from their parents and guardians. And this was coordinated by the school teachers. And also documentation can also be done by the community youth. But at this time we used the school approach. So the school approach, what we did was the pupil uses the relative as a resource person to document the food waste. So the pupil chooses a topic to research on. Let's say, for example, they pick one of the vegetables, let's say Amaranthus species, and then they go home, they take photos. We provided them with we gave each school a camera, and the teacher was the person responsible for the camera. So when one pupil had enough information, like they felt they needed the camera, they would go and ask the teacher to be given the camera so that they can go and take photos and videos of the various activities of, let's say, for example, Amaranthus, and then write an essay about the specific topic and share with the teacher and the other pupils. Then the teacher's responsibility was to read the stories and guide the pupils in case there was in any part they had forgotten in documentation. And they were also the custodians of the information and also the equipment, in this case, the cameras. And
Lucy, I'm so sorry. If you don't mind trying to wrap up so we have some time for questions and answers, if that's okay.
Yes.
So about a minute and a half, if you don't mind.
Yes, let me just go to the last one. The last one was documenting the endangered. This is what we are also continuing, the documenting of the endangered food waste heritage of the baobab tree. And this one you can read further at the mpk.org. Is there the documenting endangered food waste heritage of the baobab tree among the Mijikenda of the coastal Kenya. So this one we are able to establish food waste around the baobab and linked with the myths, ceremonies, songs, and dance. And also we try to identify and document the endangered Mijikenda foodways. And this we are doing documentation using videos, photographs, and written stories from the community. And yeah, so that is what we are doing. Yes. So some of the lessons we have learned is local communities need support from national and international institutions to especially to document some of these their cultural heritage, and modern technology like smartphones offer a good opportunity for collecting, sharing, and archiving this local knowledge. And activities such as income generation keeps the groups active, and also an incentive to maintain the biodiversity and knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. We do want to just keep a little bit of time for questions. And so since we don't have any in the Q&A feature, all those who are still here, please, you are welcome to ask questions in the Q&A box. But I would like to give you all a moment if you have any questions for each other. Often panelists in such events don't really get to talk much to each other. So we'll take a couple moments for that. And if not, I have plenty of questions for all of you.
I have a question for Junius. Thank you so much. All of the other panelists, really, thank you for such incredible work and presentations. Junius, my question is on your list of principles. One of them said something like beware of, or I don't know if beware wasn't the right word, but it said something about ethnographic methods. And I'm wondering if you could say more about that.
Sure. This was the first time I had run into this type of issue, but John D. Holman wasn't comfortable with cameras. So he was kind of like, hey, no. So we went from recording with our phones, just audio, to using GoPros that were off-centered. And yeah, and he asked, he didn't want to see them. He didn't want to see or hear the things. He was just okay with whatever process we use, and as long as we kept it to ourselves. And that was a little bit awkward for us because we wanted to be like, hey, but you see this, look how great this is. We're doing great work. But he wasn't really concerned about that. What was important to him is the quality of time that we spent together. I think that would have, in a lot of cases, I've worked with people who, when I've requested that they use, that they record in a different way, it kind of ended the project. It was like, hey, yeah, I don't want to do like cameras right now. Like, I just kind of want to do audio. And they were like, well, I'm a videographer, I'm a filmmaker, I'd like to do this. So that was my experience with that.
Any other questions for each other? And, it's been pretty quiet out there in the Q&A feature today. I'm really, really surprised. Nonetheless, picking up on what you just said, Junius, about the process, right? It's all about the process and slowing down, which is a point that's been made a number of times today. I often find, and learn about and just through my however long years in working with people and learning from them about their cultures, that there is still a tendency for the product to dictate the process, even though that product hasn't been made yet, right? And even just the product, the vision of what it looks like, the aesthetics, and then the process becomes a ticking off of boxes, right? And extractive it can be. So I think it's a really good point to refocus this. One takeaway from today certainly is to really take to heart what it means process over product. Yeah. So I think I will, we have a question. Oh, now, oh. Okay, so we'll jump right into that. So the first question is for Michelle. Your definition of community archives is ideal, but the examples we heard of today involved various integrations into large official institutions. Would you be interested in commenting on that?
Yeah, sure. It's a really good question. And I think all of these efforts exist on a continuum, right? And I think to me, what's at heart is this notion of autonomy, right? So are the communities that are the subjects of records, the creators of the records, in some cases, not all cases, but let's go with the subjects of the records, are they the same communities, if not the same exact people, that are making decisions about what will be archived, where, how, who will have access to it? And I think in some cases that kind of work can be afforded by large institutions, and in many cases it can't be, right? And so I think it just depends, right? Not all institutions are the same. It just depends, which I know is an archival studies answer. It's, that it depends, right? But I think it is important, I think, in our language to distinguish between community driven or community centered collecting at larger institutions and these independent efforts, which have different, they share some issues, but they also have a host of different issues in terms of sustainability, raising money, hiring staff, that kind of thing, right? So it's not to say that those institutions that are, those efforts that are community centered or community driven at large institutions aren't important. They are. I think they have a host of issues that they have to address, such as like, how can they do this in such a way that is not extractive, that's actually empowering the communities that are the subjects of the records? But those are kind of different issues, right? So I think it's important that we're kind of specific about our language there.
I can't help but notice the parallels and resonances between archives and museums and museology, museum and heritage discourse. And so I'm curious, you note in your presentation, Michelle, how it's been about over a decade, but not that long, where community archives and that whole world of activity is being more and more recognized. And to me, it's very similar in heritage studies and museum studies. There's a decades-long tradition of community museology, and I mean community-led, and suffering from the same issues of funding and what have you, versus mainstream museums. Eco-museology, where it's not even a museum building, it's out in a landscape, so it's safeguarding of heritage in situ, which is really interesting, decades-old movement. So yeah, I'm curious about the discourse around community documentation and archiving in the field.
Yeah, so community archives have existed since time immemorial, right? It's only just in the past 10 years that that's being recognized by dominant Western archival theory. So it's not that community archives are new at all, right? It's that the recognition of them is new. I think this leads into this second question, right? That's open right here, which is about like, what do you call this? I think those distinctions between what is a library, what is an archives, what is a museum, those are like colonialist designations that are often rooted in like dominant white supremacist ways of thinking. And so for me, I like the term memory work, because I think that encompasses this wide range of practices and kind of runs counter to that like very dominant way of cutting up the world into very different fields that is not rooted in what the practices and theories that I've seen developed in these minoritized identity-based community archives. But I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists think about that too.
Please.
Well, my first formal training in the way I identify is as a visual artist. And of course, some of that training also wasn't formal, but would you believe I consider all of the various things I do now part of my art practice? And I think Junius can probably relate there.
Yeah, most certainly. I'm working in and with communities that often feel invisibilized. So when you have a hip hop artist working with a Piedmont blues artist, how do we see each other? And that's when I have to know my privilege, right? Like I have to know that I have some privileges, and so do they, you know. And that's the exchange, you know. And that's the beauty of how relationships become symbiotic. You know, where I'm all of those things that I am equally, right? and that's the way I think about the work. If I don't, then I'm leaving something out. Therefore, I'm leaving somebody behind, because all that information that I carry comes from someone and people in my community that helped me to be who I am today.
Thank you. Lucy, since we're talking about large Western dominant institutions, I'm very curious about the motivations for nominating, and I know you'll be speaking also on behalf of Patrick, but for nominating the project, the initiative, and it's really two initiatives for the UNESCO Register of Good Safeguarding Practices, and the effects, you know, any impacts from that. You know, was it beneficial? Yes, please.
Yeah, I believe that the Foodways initiative has been in the process for quite a long time, and the National Museum and the Kendrick Department has done it for quite a while. And at the beginning, it was very like the promotion of traditional foods was quite slow. But the persistence, and also I believe like involving the community and learning from the community, the cultural importance of some of these foods was very beneficial in trying to reintroduce, because one of the challenge was the older generation didn't have a problem in consumption of this, some of these maybe traditional foods, but the younger generation had a different they were used to a different kind of cuisine. There were more now, you know, there was this modernization coming up, eating more of these fast foods. So they didn't understand some of this, the importance of these traditional foods. But once the information was transferred from the older generation, I think that there was a disconnect due to this urban migration. So the older generation was not able to transfer some of this information to the next generation. So there was what is the problem? And then try to solve some of those problems. We found there was more uptake and more positivity and more destigmatization of these traditional foods. And we at first we tried with the traditional vegetables, but now we are also we have gone to other different foods along the different foods in the communities. And we are using the same approach, and it has really helped to reintroduce back some of the traditional foods into the diet of the communities. Yeah. So it has really been, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? It's a very large platform. It brings, you know, it valorizes, you know, whatever gets touched with its golden fingers of UNESCO. I don't know where I'm going with that, but yes, you know, and to leverage, right, that promotion, you know, for whatever needs exist with, you know, those whose culture and heritage it is important. Thank you. So we do have some last minute questions here, and I will note that we will be ending in a couple minutes, but we may go over the 2:30 East Coast time ending. So we have a question from Sarah Bryan. In response to Junius's sharing the story of his ongoing relationship with the Holman family, I wonder, have the panelists had many experiences with descendants or surviving relatives of deceased tradition bearers who are represented in your collections, whose feelings about the collection differ from how the tradition bearers themselves wished or agreed to be represented, whether wanting to add or remove particular restrictions, edit transcripts, etc.? Very good question.
Yeah, I'll lead. You know, I think the quick answer is yes. But for me, the work and the relationship was with the first collaborator. You know, so their wishes and the things that they wanted is how we documented things, and it's what we put in writing that we would do. So for me, that comes first. And when you talk about family, you know, I think it's safe to say in this situation when there'll be different periods of how different family members feel based on their relationship with the collaborator and how long it's been since they passed. You know, so for us, it's just been important to sit still, you know, and kind of massage any situations and allow them to have some say in it. But ideally, we will try to work in the best interests of the collaborator.
Sure. Anybody want to add to that? And then just first from this panel, if we may, Tony, thank you. Anybody, Ashley,
I
please.
can. So this hasn't happened yet. However, I try to abide by something one of my cousin collaborators says, which is tell the most truth with the most love. So I try to not embarrass anyone with information that makes it into the archives or their family members. And also you're making me think about how to build this into the shared stewardship agreement that we're creating for the new collection at UMBC. And the way we're going about this, the head curator and head of special collections, Beth Saunders, who's wonderful, and I are hashing out a draft, and then we're actually now here bringing art back to it. There's a process that was developed by Liz Lerman, who is a dancer and choreographer, called critical response process, whereby folks can respond to a creative work and give feedback lovingly, and then we're going to go through this with community members just to see how it lands, and like, you know, how can we plan for something like that if it were to happen in the future? Like who I am inclined to agree with Junius, like it's the wishes of the person you had the collaboration with that should be honored first, but maybe people in the community will feel differently, and then like how do we resolve that, because it's not just my thing. So that's really great food for thought. Thank you for asking the question.
Sure, Tony.
And actually, my answer is very much the same. In South America, very frequently, the performers really want their sounds to be heard, and they really want their ideas to be spread around. But their children, who may have converted to a different religion, are suddenly embarrassed by those and would like to have them silenced. Their grandchildren, on the other hand, might want them back. And so I think time is a very interesting and complex aspect of relationships. And I think in my heart, I think we owe it to the person who originally thought this is something I want other people to see or hear or learn about, should be represented as much as possible, even if it means just keeping it around for another generation while the current generation doesn't look at it or hear it.
Thank you. Andy, I think you had a comment you'd like to make. Oh,
hi. I just want to say thank you to Junius for that breakdown of collaborative work. You know, I mean, like we basically do that stuff, but we've never spelled it out. And I think it's so valuable to have it spelled out, and I can't wait to share it with colleagues. So thanks for that.
Well, any final comments or questions? Because we are a little over time. I guess that's it. So I want to, oh, we have a question coming in from my backstage buddy, Alina Magoni. Can you clarify the difference between, oh, this is a big question. Can you clarify the difference between community archives versus community-driven archives?
I'll give a 2-minute response to like a 8-hour question, which is, I think that the term community archives has been so overused. It's such a general term that it has, in some cases, been rendered meaningless, right? So Flynn, Stevens, and Shepard say that a community is any group of people who come together and call themselves a community. So in that sense, like all archives are community archives because all archives involve people who come together. I think the real distinction we need to be making is community-driven or community-centered or community accountable projects that are projects within dominant institutions versus independent, minoritized, identity-based community archives, which are their own separate organizations that are run by the same group of people who is also creating records or are the subject of records and doing the archival work.
Thank you. Well, that's very concise. Would anyone else want to add to that? All right, we do have one more question, and I just want to note to our hosts and panelists, we're going to go a little over time. I just spoke with Elizabeth. Okay, so our last question, in particular, this is for you, Lucy. Were the assignments and the essays, et cetera, in your school projects, the school-based aspects of your efforts, were they considered part of or clubbed with the curriculum too?
So at first, this was a part of a club, like let's say like a ecology club or something like that. So the school projects were first parts of like one of the school clubs because they have different school clubs. And then now over like the last, since last year, the government is introducing like one of the club into the curriculum, which some of this project would be part of, like examining, yeah, like part of the examination, like they're given, for contributing to such, they are given some marks, yeah. But before it wasn't when it started, but now it is slowly being included into the curriculum. Yes.
Thank you, Lucy. Well, on that note, I think we will finally end this wonderful day. So thank you all to all of you distinguished guests from the whole day long. Thank you to Robert. Thank you to all my backstage buddies. Thank you to Nikki and John Fenn as well. And I do want to note, as you see in the chat, that the event was recorded and it will be made available in the near future on the Library of Congress website, as well as its YouTube channel, so you can watch it over and over. And I will most likely be blogging about this event on the AFC's Folklife Today blog, and you can subscribe to it at the link in the chat. And as Robert mentioned earlier, I will add in bibliographic references that all of our participants would like to add into that at the end. And always, if you want to learn more about the center and our collections, you can reach us at folklife@loc.gov. So again, thank you, everyone. This has been a really excellent day.